The game's abbreviated name is Demrock, and immediately after its release, it took first place in the world rankings. Demrock opens a new world of VR gaming, conquering the global market and becoming the game of the year, a legendary game with over 100 million online players. But as time went on, its popularity inevitably began to decline, and player activity and interest in the game decreased. And now, sometime later, she is preparing to close her servers. At this time, the system inside the game announced that the server was ending, with 30 minutes remaining until shutdown. The black-haired boy sitting near the fire was named Kaiser. He was #1 in the Demrock rankings. Next to him sat Taste Purple, 5th place, who said that he always wanted this game to end, but did not expect that this would actually happen. The Sword Emperor, who was in 4th place, supported him because it was really fun here. The white-haired girl said that after killing a dragon, a brick drops. She didn't understand how the game lasted so long. The Sword Emperor was angry at the girl who had ruined the whole atmosphere. But she didn't understand why he was angry, because it was true. Upon hearing about her stupid mask, the girl immediately started screaming that the guy had apparently decided to fight with her. Their argument was interrupted by a black-haired guy who took a step forward, thereby drawing the attention of those around him. With a smile on his face, looking towards the fire, he said that it was all sad. The muscular man turned to the first-place player with a smile, saying that he had studied this game much more diligently than anyone else, and they all understood that. For when he watched his comrades battle, he thought it was a divine game. The white-haired girl, spreading her hands, said that God was still just because his luck was the worst of them all. The others immediately started smiling because first place was occupied by a guy who didn't even have a legendary skill. They laughed as they recalled how, after every equipment failure, he would shout that the world was against him. And they also noticed that if you look closely, the black-haired one is the most harmful of them. This whole discussion caused laughter among them, and they happily recalled their past. The Emperor of Swords agreed with them, because the strongest one turned out to be the unluckiest among them. And so, the system thanked every online player for being with them until the very end. The players' bodies began to sparkle, and each one began to say goodbye to their friends with a smile. Although there was a smile on their faces, each of them understood in their hearts that this was the end of their long story. They hoped that they would see each other again in some other but still worthwhile game. And so, gradually, all the players standing around the black-haired guy disappeared. But he remained standing in the same place where he stood. He looked at the growing fire, which gradually became brighter and brighter in his eyes. And so, sometime later, he disappeared. And he himself, his body evaporated. He was the last player to leave. And so, after a huge amount of time, the game was closed. The main character removed the VR glasses from his face. 2 whole years have passed since then, and a lot has changed during this time. A green bus was speeding through the city center at quite a high speed. There were some guys sitting inside, 2 of them glued to their phones, discussing the incredible control. They were watching a video, discussing how one of the players had single-handedly taken down a demon lord. The duo knew that among the rankers, the Liquidator from the Executioner's Guild was the best and strongest. They declared with admiration that the guild was cool, but they liked the Empress more, because she always acted alone. One of the guys also stated that there was probably no player who could surpass her, but the other one didn't agree with that. The second boy said that the one who was the strongest at the time was Demrock, the #1 ranked Kaiser. However, they said with great sadness that he disappeared immediately after the servers were closed, and no one knew where he was now. It's been 2 years since Demrock closed, and now the most popular game is Demrock's sequel, Year of Savior. Or they simply call it Godos, a world with even more players, new races and new professions that were not in the old version of the game. The game became famous for the fact that players had absolute freedom of action within it. Next to them sat a black-haired guy in a military uniform, who, with a smile on his face, thought about how they should wait, because he had returned. It was that same top 1 player, Kaiser, who was demobilized with the rank of sergeant. The guy's name was Kang Do-hyun. The boy couldn't wait to get home, because there was a gift waiting for him at home. Having run home, and as soon as he opened the doors, he immediately shouted where the capsule was. His sister joyfully greeted her brother who had returned, but he didn't listen to anyone, rushing to his room. His mother couldn't believe that he had just returned from the army and was already thinking about the capsule. Running into the room, he thought about how, when he was little, all he did was call for his mother. But suddenly, he threw away absolutely all thoughts. His eyes filled with admiration, and his face gradually began to redden. Looking ahead, he couldn't believe that this was what he had only seen on the news. It was a real VR capsule. Running up to her and starting to hug her, he couldn't believe that after a 1.5 years of service in the army, he was finally able to save up for her. He immediately began to feel her up with an obscene expression, trying to penetrate every curve. And so, literally a few seconds later, he opened it. The black-haired boy could not resist. Sitting in it, he said that although it was used, the upholstery was still very soft. Grabbing the helmet, he immediately began to put it on, anticipating his first entry into the new game. And as soon as he put it on, it immediately activated. The space around him began to fill with blue color. It seemed like his body was being transported somewhere. The system announced that the iris scan had been completed, began checking the ID card, and then synchronization. Just a few seconds later, the game said, "Welcome to Adventurer's Paradise." To begin with, she asked the guy to create his own character, moving him into a huge room with a mirror. Looking towards the mirror, Can wondered if this was his character. As he began to stroke his head, he thought that he looked too much like a soldier, so he immediately started going through hairstyles. But he quickly got bored with it, so he decided to choose at random. And so, after completing the creation of the appearance, the system asked to come up with a nickname, where the black-haired man immediately thought about it. However, these thoughts were quickly thrown back, and with a smile, he said that his name was Kaiser. At that very second, the world around the guy began to fill with blue again, and the system announced that the character had been successfully created. After congratulating the protagonist on this, she moved him to the training area, explaining that this was the site of the former horrific battle for Castle Aaron. Looking around, Kaiser couldn't believe that this was what a fully immersive game looked like. The system immediately began pouring out different weapon options, asking the guy to choose. Having carefully examined each of the proposed options, he realized that they did not offer anything special. So he decided to take what he was used to. And with these thoughts, he pulled his hand forward. And then, with a terrifyingly satisfied smile, he pulled a sharp, shiny sword out of the system window. He remembered how he used the sword in Demrock. While he was examining his blade, he heard a voice that caught his attention. Looking back, he saw a man running straight towards him at quite a high speed. It was Charlie, the captain of the Knights, a fair-haired man shouting at the protagonist to ask him what he was doing there. But without waiting for an answer, he grabbed his hand, shouting for him to run after him immediately. Charlie shouted as he explained that other mercenaries had already joined the fight, at which point the system notified Kaiser that he had joined a group with Charlie. Our heroes ran quite fast, without stopping at all. Everything around was on fire. Loud sounds could be heard. Running into one of the buildings, horror appeared on Charlie's face while our protagonist tried to understand what was going on. Looking out from behind the Knight Captain, he saw rivers of blood, as well as a huge number of dead bodies. The yellow-haired knight said that they had finally dealt with these creatures, because according to rumors, they had made a contract with the monster. Turning to the Kaiser, he declared that if they did not hurry and stop them, then the very one would come to this world and destroy it. Starting to open the doors, he ordered the black-haired man to hurry, because they would get there much faster through this entrance. The protagonist silently followed the instructions, trying to gather as much information as possible. So he silently followed the orders. But as soon as they entered inside, a huge number of arrows immediately flew towards them, which began to land right at the feet of our heroes. Charlie was quite surprised by this turn of events. Suddenly, a rather nasty sound was heard. Looking forward, he immediately clenched his teeth. After all, right in front of him stood a huge army of monsters who were clenching their teeth, making animal sounds. Turning to the main character, he was about to say that they had already arrived here. He was going to break through them, but he didn't have time. After all, that same black-haired guy whom he had been leading all this time rushed forward, straight towards this huge beast army. One of the creatures standing in front threw his weapon right behind his back, about to kill the main character with one attack. Naturally, our protagonist was ready for this, his eyes filled with bright color. The yellow-haired captain himself shouted to his comrade to be careful. He began to worry about him. But Kaiser himself was not going to lose so easily. He stopped abruptly, raising dust. Due to the sudden stop, the monster missed. He couldn't hit the black-haired man. Naturally, the little animal didn't understand how this had happened, because he was definitely hitting the target. The protagonist, seeing that the monster was taken aback by such a surprise, immediately grabbed his blade. With a slight movement, he cut the attacker, and blood began to splatter in all directions. But the black-haired man was not going to stop there. He immediately began to gather energy. He rushed forward with incredible speed and began to chop down the monsters one after another, giving them absolutely no chance. The monsters standing behind could not believe their eyes. Their fighting spirit began to completely sell out. They were afraid. Suddenly, one of the closest ones threw his weapon behind his back with a loud cry, intending to kill the black-haired upstart. But here too, with cold blood, the main character simply jumped back. thereby dodging the attacker's attack. And then he jumped up, raising his knee, getting ready to strike. Because the man's speed was incredibly fast, the monster was unable to dodge and received a direct hit to the jaw. There was a rather painful sound, and blood again scattered in different directions. Stopping, the protagonist noticed a pair of monsters standing in front of him, their bodies trembling as they looked at him. With shaking hands, they began to try to force arrows into their crossbows. However, the protagonist had no intention of leaving anyone alive. He immediately gathered his energy, preparing to rush forward. In an instant, he closed in on them, delivering a powerful slashing blow, thereby killing the latter. Immediately after this, he stopped and began to look around. At this time, those who were struck by the black-haired hero fell dead, covered in blood. Swinging his sword, the protagonist threw red drops off his blade, and a thick smell of blood began to rise around. With a smile on his face, he thought that he had been worried in vain about not having played for a long time, because not everything was so bad. Jumping from foot to foot, he noticed that his body was much lighter than it had been before. He was distracted from his own thoughts by Charlie, who shouted that it was incredible that the black-haired man had managed to cope alone. The system immediately notified the protagonist that the Knight Captain's sympathy had been increased. Lost in thought, the protagonist remembered that there was something similar in Demrock, but he didn't remember it growing after the first battle. Looking at the guy, the Knight Captain thought that perhaps the very hero from the legends was standing in front of him, because he was incredibly strong. Just a few seconds later, the system notified the guy that the sympathy had been increased to such a degree that Charlie now trusted him completely. And then she even rewarded Kaiser with a 2-point increase in his characteristics, as well as an increase in sympathy. The Knight Captain threw up his hands and laughed, shouting that thanks to the hero, everything had gone much easier than it should have. Pointing forward to the door, he said that they would have to eliminate the warlock inside, and after that, the war would end in their victory. Suddenly, a powerful explosion sounded inside them, which destroyed the ceiling. Charlie could not believe that the summoning had already begun. A dark energy ran through the entire area, destroying everything that was directly in front of it under its pressure. Suddenly, red eyes appeared from a huge hole, and disgusting animal sounds were heard throughout the area. Turning to Kaiser, the yellow-haired knight shouted that he would take care of these, asking the boy to stop the summoner. Drawing his sword, he released his energy, telling the protagonist that he relied on his strength. Turning to the guy, he released an incredible amount of energy, saying that he hoped that luck would be on his side. And then, with a loud cry, still releasing energy, he rushed forward straight towards the opened rift. The main character himself stood with his mouth open at this time, not understanding whether he really needed to go in. He didn't understand how this had happened, because in the video guides, Charlie was always the first to enter. However, he had also heard that the plot changed depending on the player's actions, but he didn't understand how it was possible to do so much. Approaching the door, the same dark energy that caused the floor to crack passed right under the protagonist's feet. But the black-haired Kaiser himself did not pay attention to this, only proudly raising his head, looking at the huge wooden door. The system immediately explained that only one person could enter, and in the event of death, the seal would be destroyed and all negative effects would be removed from the boss. Upon hearing these notifications, the protagonist immediately realized that this was a hidden element. A hidden element is a mechanic intentionally hidden in the game that is activated under certain conditions and can result in a special reward. The system asked the guy if he really wanted to enter, but Kaiser wasn't about to throw away such a chance, as there was no reason to miss out on such a rarity. So he proudly gave a positive answer. The door immediately began to open, and Kaiser's face became serious. But as soon as he entered, he heard screams that someone had to listen. And then he saw blood splattering in all directions. Raising his head, he saw huge teeth that were covered in scarlet blood. The boy's face completely changed at that moment, because he saw in front of him the very thing that was not a real monster. After all, it was impossible to examine even this entire huge scaly body in one glance. Just a moment later, a scarlet system notification appeared. It was the captured iron-blooded demon dragon. Having the title of legendary named boss, the danger was hidden, but all of his abilities and movements were limited. The main character himself was surprised by such a meeting, because a legendary creature stood before him. Godos actually borrowed a lot from the old Demrock. The items were the same: common, rare, heroic, and legendary. One of the borrowings was the system of ranks, of which there were 4. Ranks apply to absolutely everything, even bosses, but the most special ones among them are. They had unique names and were considered the rarest and most unique monsters, such as the demon dragon. Standing in front of him, the main character understood that this was the boss. Opening its mouth, the dragon screeched loudly, creating a deafening roar that made the earth shake. The main character continued to stand in one place, staring at the dragon, and at the same second after the roar, system notifications began to appear. The roar reduced physical stats, movement speed, attack speed, defense, and magic resistance. He was dissatisfied, thinking that the game had no conscience at all, since he had only just entered. Suddenly, he remembered that the dragon's abilities were sealed, deciding to try to break through. However, he understood that if he touched him with his paw, he would immediately throw in the towel. The situation was not the best, but he compared this situation with Demrock. He recalled his past gaming achievements, where even then he had only one way out. As he began to draw his sword, his expression changed. He understood that everything here was simple: do or die. Suddenly, he glanced to the side where the aura had completely changed. At that very moment, the dragon struck, which our main character managed to dodge. Leaping to the side, he landed on his feet, a terrifying aura raging around him. Rushing towards the dragon's paw, he delivered a powerful blow, trying to make a cut where he hit the target precisely. At that very moment, the dragon began to squeal in pain. The cry echoed throughout the room, its roar raising a gust of wind, which in turn almost knocked our black-haired guy off his feet. Glancing back, the boy's face changed. He even looked scared for a second. He immediately jumped to the side, and a moment later a powerful blow struck the place where the boy was standing. Due to the gust of wind that arose, our boy was thrown back several meters. His gaze was cold-blooded. He continued to peer towards the dragon, studying every part of his body. Looking towards the monster, he couldn't shake the thought that he had only dealt 120 damage in 2 attacks. As he exhaled, he thought that the community hadn't lied. The complexity had truly been prohibitive. Having collected his thoughts, the protagonist rushed into the attack, starting to deliver attack after attack to the monster. He had no intention of stopping, knowing that he only needed to keep attacking without ceasing in order to defeat him. Blood flew in all directions as the protagonist continued to launch attack after attack. The dragon demon itself was not going to simply accept attacks. It also attacked, forcing the protagonist to retreat and defend himself. At some point, the black-haired hero managed to pierce the dragon's huge paw with his blade. The black-skinned man's roar grew even louder. The walls around him shook, and the stones began to rise up. And at that very moment, after a roar, the demon dragon simply fell to the ground covered in wounds. The system notified the guy that he was the first in history to kill the legendary named boss in the training, and the achievement was recorded in the adventure book. The main character himself could barely stand on his feet. His entire body was covered in bruises, and he could only think that the creature had turned out to be very tenacious. Once he caught his breath, he pulled his sword out of his paw, thinking about what if he was the first, so those monsters couldn't defeat him either. That's what the boy thought as he looked around. He remembered his comrades from Demrock, who were clearly unhappy with the appearance of this monster. Remembering them, a smile appeared on his face. He was interested in how his old friends were doing now. Suddenly, the system notified that the guy had received the title of First Killer, and his characteristics began to awaken. Weapon Master, Hidden Dragon, Assassin, Hero, Overcoming, Protagonist. Read these notifications with his mouth open. The system also endowed the guy with a unique skill, the Eye of Truth. And the guy himself was surprised by such a huge number of skills. He didn't understand how one could acquire such a huge number of skills in training, since usually they only taught one. Characteristics, also known as skills, are one of the special systems in Godos. They come in a variety of forms, from search-based ones that act as a guide, to combat-based ones like the Swordmaster. Depending on the player's achievements, he is assigned characteristics of a higher rank. The main character was in shock. He began to carefully study his characteristics, and when he reached the last one, his look changed. The boy understood that all the skills of the Swordmaster and Assassin type were good, even very good, but they were not unique. The black-haired man thought that even if there was no person who had all of them at once, they were found separately quite often. But he also acquired a unique skill, the Eye of Truth, literally a one-of-a-kind characteristic. A satisfied smile appeared on his face. He was happy with this award, because it was the most that was not a jackpot. In just one training session, the main character was able to obtain 1 unique and 5 normal characteristics, with an incredible title. Naturally, he was glad about this, because in the last game he hadn't had much luck with this, when suddenly he was distracted from his thoughts, glancing towards the door. After all, literally a moment before this, his fair-haired comrade had finished his fight, trying to catch his breath as quickly as possible. And as soon as he did this, he immediately went towards the door where the black-haired boy had entered. He could barely move his legs from fatigue, The fight had been quite difficult for him. He was covered in bruises. Once inside, he immediately turned to his dark-haired young comrade. After asking where the monster had gone, since the roar was terrifying, he asked the boy standing inside if the monster was dead. But without waiting for an answer, he could not believe that there was not a single scratch on the guy. With a trembling voice, he asked who he was. The protagonist didn't know what to answer, but the knight himself said that all these questions were not important, because it didn't matter who he was or where he was from. Pressing his hand to his chest, the knight declared that true heroes always appear to the world in troubled times, and his appearance in this world engulfed in chaos will become a ray of light that will bring great changes. And immediately after these words, Charlie's face lit up. He declared that he did not doubt his words one bit, and then he fell to the ground, getting up on one knee and loudly saying that he asked the guy for only one thing, so that he, a humble knight, would become his faithful blade in future adventures. System notifications immediately popped up in front of the guy. Kaiser, studying them, could not believe that if he agreed, the NPC would cease to be a knight and become his subordinate, and all the privileges of a knight would pass to him. Suddenly, the system added that he had been dead for a long time, so he would not be able to receive his privileges, even if he became his master. And then the main character remembered that training is a recreation of past events, realizing that this is just a formality. So he gave positive words. The man's face immediately lit up, and the system informed the protagonist that in Captain Charlie's memory, he would forever remain a master. The system also said that the man would find peace. This notification quite stressed Kaiser out, and then everything around him started to glow. The system explained that in a moment he would be transported to the Pantheon. A portal appeared not far from the two standing, emitting a rather pleasant energy. At that very second, Charlie turned to his master, which surprised the black-haired protagonist. With a smile on his face, Knight Charlie asked his master where they were going with him now. The black-haired protagonist immediately glanced to the side, pondering Charlie's words in the system. Without thinking twice, with a terrifying expression on his face, he declared that they were going where they were needed most at the moment. With pride in his voice, Kaiser said that the world is currently in turmoil. Hearing these words from his master, Charlie was once again convinced that it was not in vain that he had chosen this particular boy as his master. And then our heroes entered the teleport. The transfer was supposed to begin in 5 seconds. Suddenly, inside the portal, Charlie took out some kind of amulet, asking his master to take it as a gift. Taking the bright stone, the main character began to look at it, not understanding what it was. And at that very moment, Knight Charlie, with a smile on his face, thanked the main character, and at that very moment spoke about salvation. After these words, the system greeted the protagonist, explaining that this was the Pantheon, where he had to choose a god and a path. Standing in front of a huge column that towered upward, the system asked the boy to decide on his next path. Looking around, the main character thought that this was the very Pantheon around him. Instead of the noble name of Pantheon, this place was most often called a card lottery, a place that made you cry and laugh. Countless players. The call of the gods unfolds here. One could only serve one, and the choice depended on the class. Moreover, in Godos, everything is divided into ranks, and the gods also had their own hierarchy. Gods of legends, gods of heroes, and gods of myths. The gods of legends are those who have attained divinity through stories passed down orally. Hero gods are people who were called heroes in the past and who ascended to the pantheon, becoming gods. And finally, the gods of myths, those who created the entire mythology. These include Zeus, or one of the Scandinavian mythologies. Of course, the further down the list, the higher the rank. The system asked the guy to choose the god he wanted to serve. Looking around, he thought that he was unlucky anyway, so there was no point in being greedy. When suddenly his gaze changed, he noticed one of the cards, which was glowing much brighter than the others. Looking at it, he did not understand what was going on. At that very second, the Eye of Truth was automatically activated, and the boy completely forgot that he could see through what was hidden. Finally realizing how incredible this ability is, approaching the card, he thought that if this was true, then from now on he would be able to choose the card he needed in any lottery. He immediately began to remember his past, where former top players called him pathetic because of his bad luck, trying to support him by saying that one day luck would be on his side too. He just had to wait. Naturally, at that moment he thought that this would not happen. Constantly joking it off, he felt too bitter at that moment in his soul. However, now, with this power, he will be able to climb to the top of the ranks again. He could barely restrain himself from screaming with joy, but he didn't hide his smile. It was all the way from his ears. Placing his hand on that very golden card, He thought that he would naturally choose it. As soon as he grabbed it in his hand, its color became even brighter. The entire map was covered in a bright yellow light. The system immediately notified that the guy had drawn the god of myths, the one-armed sword god Tyr, asking the guy if he agreed. Immediately, a smile appeared on the black-haired man's face again. He was pleased with this. At that very moment, the system said that the apostle's vessel was not formed. He could not become the apostle of Tyr. The main character was at a loss to understand what had happened. Even God himself was puzzled by the unexpected situation. The boy thought to himself that he had never even heard of such an outcome of events anywhere. Suddenly, he repeated the word vessel in his head several times, remembering that players usually lose to the dragon demon, after which the goddess appeared and granted each of them a revelation. However, he killed him, and the goddess never appeared, meaning that it was all because he didn't receive the revelation. He immediately called up the system characteristics window and began to study them carefully. And then I realized that in the class column where apostle should have been listed, there was nothing. The black-haired protagonist didn't understand what to do because everything had turned out really badly. After looking at the cards, he realized that in this case they were useless, because any of the cards would tell him that there was no vessel. Falling to his knees, he felt bitterness in his mouth, because he had waited for this moment for so long. And in the end, nothing came of it. He clutched his head, thinking that if he deleted the character and created a new one, he would have to wait a whole 60 days. Suddenly, he opened his eyes, looking to the side in confusion. He noticed that right under his feet there was a red card that was emitting a rather eerie aura. Coming closer, he bent down, grabbing it. He had never heard or read anywhere about the red rank of the card before. The system immediately notified him that he had chosen a hidden card. He had chosen Cassiar, the forgotten last adventurer. And then our main character realized that this was a hidden continent. His facial expression immediately changed. At that very second, our hero's body was covered in a red aura, and the system notified him that he had received a class, the Last Adventurer. The class allowed one to use skills without being limited by class boundaries, a power capable of opposing even the gods. The boy immediately thought that with this, he could choose only the most useful skills and create the perfect skill tree. In any case, thanks to the Eye of Truth, he is guaranteed to be able to obtain the necessary skills. And if you add to this the Master of Weapons, this will be an absolute player, with absolutely no weak points. This is exactly what the main character was thinking right now with a terrifying face. The system spoke. Since the class change was complete, it began the transfer to Avatar Tell. At the moment of movement, a sinister smile appeared on the protagonist's face. He was thinking about only one thing. The black-haired man thought that thanks to this, he would be able to try to climb to the top again. And so the singing of birds was heard all around. The weather was clear, and the rays of the sun covered the entire area. The main character moved to Avatar Tell, Arda, the city of the beginning, as the players called it. The players discussed the calls among themselves, supporting each other. Some of them could barely hold back tears, while others explained that there were many things to do in the city besides the fighting. Among this huge crowd stood two men in suits. They were scouts. Officially, they are the ones who recruit new members to the guild. But in reality, players treat them like annoying street barkers. One of these scouts scratched his head and said that he should find at least one player this month, because otherwise the management would be unhappy. Suddenly, a dark-haired man standing nearby asked his partner to pay attention to one of the guys. Looking at our main character, they thought that he was a walking disaster, because he was completely lost. They decided to go around him, trying not to look in his direction so that he wouldn't follow them. The main character himself studied the notification window. He was awarded a heroic item. Its properties were incredible. He felt like he was wrapped in the sweetest honey, because there was no limit to this luck. The next window immediately popped up. The system gave the main character a quest. He needed to clear out the goblins. This notification window appeared in front of everyone standing in this crowd. Everyone was shocked, because even those who were still in line were given it. A man appeared in front of the crowd and shouted that he relied on them all to exterminate the goblins as quickly as possible. Immediately, everyone began to gather people into their team. No one wanted to go on a cleanup mission alone. Observing this, the main character realized that everyone was gathering in groups. He was immediately distracted from his thoughts by a group of guys. One of them explained that they were going to level up to level 12, offering our hero to go with them, at the same time receiving a group bonus. Deep in thought, Kaiser began to consider their proposal, coming to the conclusion that these guys were right. After all, hunting is much easier in a group, and if you take into account the bonus experience, then team play was simply necessary. So he immediately answered the guys that he was in, and a group window immediately appeared in front of him, The leader considered the main character to be a Kaiser fan. The girl in the group didn't understand who he was talking about, so the archer explained to her that it was the player who held first place in Demrock. The protagonist himself did not participate in these discussions, deciding to abstain and not reveal his identity. Suddenly, after discussing the former top player for a bit, the group shouted in one voice that it was time to go. After watching the group's actions, Kaiser repeated them, raising his hands up. And so, for some time, our heroes were already in battle. The best shield was adjusting his skills, which stunned the goblins for a second. Immediately after this attack, he commanded the group to go on the offensive. The mage and archer immediately used their powers, sending attacks from a distance towards the monsters. And so, as soon as the joint attack of the two reached its target, one of the goblins was defeated. As soon as the green one fell, the rest of his relatives naturally became angry. They were not happy with such a picture. Therefore, they immediately rushed into the attack, intending to avenge their brother. A pair of green-skinned men pounced on the tank, forcing it to go on the defensive. The comrades standing behind became afraid for their commander and cried out in alarm in one voice. The leader of the group himself ordered an immediate attack to kill the attacker. However, they asked him to wait a little, since he had a cooldown on using attacks. And so, the third one, standing behind, jumped high into the sky, preparing to deliver a clear blow to the shield's back. Seeing the attack from the air, he understood that if he let go of the shield, he would have to fight three at once. He would not be able to cope with them. For a moment, he saw a satisfied grin on the goblin's face, because literally a moment later, he would be able to cut up the little man. But it was not to be, because the trio completely forgot that there was another person in the human group who, having thrown himself into the sky, was able to cut down one of the attackers with maximum ease. The leader was the first to notice, surprised by such speed and such force of attack. Following this, the remaining two also noticed it. They could barely make it out, but they couldn't believe their eyes. They found it hard to believe that the newcomer could move like that. The main character himself was not going to stop there, because he still had two goals ahead of him. He rushed into place in an instant, rushing towards the green monsters, and he also caught up with them in an instant, not giving them a chance to defend themselves. With a light movement of his sword, he cut them down, and the system notified them of the murder. The duo standing behind could not be more pleased with the outcome of the situation. At that very moment, amid the joyful cries of his comrades, the Kaiser hid his blade. The leader ran up and happily told the black-haired man that it was a great job, telling the guy that he was too good at fighting. With a happy face, he was about to say that if everything continued like this, they would easily cope. But he didn't have time. He immediately shouted to his black-haired comrade to look back, and immediately the faces of our heroes changed. After all, a huge crowd of goblins emerged from the forest, making disgusting sounds. Their faces were terrible. They giggled among themselves, realizing that the crowd would be able to crush the newcomers. The commander turned around and was about to give the order to retreat. But he didn't have time, because the black-haired man rushed into battle. Ignoring the cries of his comrades, Kaiser ran straight towards the crowd of monsters, intending to engage them in battle. The goblins, seeing just one person approaching them, could not contain their laughter. At the very last moment, the protagonist jumped up, throwing his blade behind his back. He released a terrifying aura, intending to kill every single one of those standing in this crowd. There was silence, and it seemed that the area was so quiet that the rustling of leaves could be heard. But just a moment later, there was a loud explosion, and a thick column of dust rose into the sky. The main character recalled the past, where his friend said that he was a bully. The main character himself did not understand what his muscular comrade meant. The jock explained that he was low on health. And then suddenly, someone like a boss appeared and Kaiser immediately rushed at him. He thought that this was the very thing that was not recklessness. But the top one player himself did not understand, because he was the one who finished him off in the end. But the muscular comrade insisted on his own, because it was dangerous. And then, looking at this crowd, the main character asked himself if this was really recklessness. However, he reduced it to the fact that he was simply defending himself. He had no need to fight, exposing himself to unnecessary risk. And at that very moment, with these thoughts, he rushed into battle. When his comrades called him, the black-haired boy didn't think about it at all. All he thought about was that he never fought recklessly. The Kaiser always thought through his actions several moves ahead, assessing the chances of victory. And at that very moment, he was extremely confident of his victory. And that very calm before the explosion seemed so to everyone, because screams could be heard. However, the explosion was so loud that it seemed as if there had been deathly silence before. Blow after blow, the protagonist cut down one goblin after another. Kaiser glanced back and noticed that there was one last poison goblin behind him. He immediately leaned on his other leg, preparing to rush towards him. With incredible speed, he began to approach the goblins. Based on experience from previous battles, he understood that in a fight against a crowd, it was better to eliminate the shooters first. So he targeted them first, cutting them down one by one. Blood sprayed in all directions, and a thick smell of blood gradually began to rise into the air. The overcoming characteristic was activated. The protagonist's eyes turned yellow. He noticed the approaching attack, so he was able to repel it without any heaviness. Naturally, the goblin sniper did not expect this. His face showed surprise, but it didn't last long, because just a second later, the black-haired boy cut it down. Due to the incredible speed, the boy couldn't even stop right away, sliding for several meters. Another monster pounced on the boy who was looking around, intending to take advantage of the man's respite. However, even here the attack did not reach its target. With a slight movement of his hand, the black-haired man was able to repel the attack. And then, raising his sword, he began to gather strength to deliver another powerful blow. The goblin could do nothing against the man, so he lost his life. At that very moment, the system notified that all restrictions had been lifted. The guy had received a skill, a blow to a vulnerable spot. The Kaiser was delighted by this, grabbing the goblin's flying weapon. With incredible force, he thrust the goblin's own weapon into one of the goblins. This time, 2 skills were used at once, vulnerable spot and critical strike, so the goblin died immediately. And so, Kaiser knocked a wooden bat out of the hands of one of the goblins, and the system immediately notified him that he had acquired the swing skill. She flew high into the sky, leaving the goblin completely unarmed. Having approached the attacker, the black-haired man knocked over his weapon. Seeing this incredible power and speed up close, the green-skinned man was stunned, and fear appeared on his face. However, it was already too late, because a moment later a dagger was thrust straight into his jaw. And after that, the main character let him go, catching the flying bat. With a light swing, he was able to smash the goblin's head, blood splattering in all directions. The system immediately began to issue notifications, increasing the skills of our protagonist, who, in turn, thought that this was actually very good. After all, he thought that he could just learn skills without restrictions. But he didn't know that he could use them right away on the spot. His face immediately turned red with admiration, because this was much cooler than he could have even imagined. Our hero's comrades watched this entire massacre, unable to say a word. The leader did not understand how this was even possible. These thoughts did not leave him at all. Even an experienced group would have to work hard to overcome such a crowd of goblins. But he couldn't get his head around the fact that this boy could cope all by himself. Looking at the black-haired boy, he saw his nickname, which towered right above his head, and also felt a terrifying aura. At some point, Best Shield even began to think that this was the same Kaiser from the time of Demrock. However, he almost immediately dismissed these thoughts, considering them to be pure nonsense, since that same genius ranker had disappeared without a trace 2 years ago, and he couldn't have been in his group. Looking at the black-haired guy, he only wondered who he was. At this time, the main character himself could not enjoy his own power, because it was much better than in the previous game. Seeing this reaction, Best Shield thought the boy had completely lost his mind. Suddenly, the weapon in the boy's hands began to shine, and he immediately let it go, and it gradually disappeared completely. The boy realized that the weapon that did not drop as loot simply disappeared. With a smile on his face, he thought about how he had removed the restrictions on weapons and even tested the skills. So he was quite satisfied with the result. Kaiser immediately called up the system window, and after examining it, he realized that he had increased 3 levels in one hunt. Although he wasn't tied to one specific weapon, his base was the sword, and after increasing his strength and dexterity, he decided to invest the remaining points into perception. And the rest of the title should be covered, and also don't forget about Charlie's necklace. Suddenly, his comrades ran up to him, shouting about how incredible their comrade was. They couldn't believe that such a strong player decided to join their group. The captain jokingly asked if he was that same Kaiser, but the archers said that that Kaiser had retired long ago. But the leader didn't quite believe it, because watching their Kaisers battle, these thoughts didn't leave him. The boys continued to praise the black-haired boy as he stood silently and awkwardly scratched his head, with a smile on his face, thinking that he is the real Kaiser. Suddenly, the archer asked the guy if he had really pulled out the mythical god, since he had insane damage. However, the main character replied that it was all thanks to his characteristics. And, in addition, he was lucky with his title. Upon hearing about the title, the 3 of them immediately shouted in unison that at this rate, he would soon become a ranker. And so, for a few more minutes, they chatted pleasantly, restoring their strength. Suddenly, the group's commander, Shield, announced that their forces had been restored, suggesting that they continue the hunt. The archer joyfully shouted that this time he could take down 10 of them at once. With a smile on his face, Kaiser said that it was a great idea. The girls shouted that as long as Kaiser was with them, they weren't afraid of anything. Watching this picture, old memories came flooding back to the protagonist. He remembered his comrades who were also arguing about whether they should go further or not, hoping that the Kaiser would sort everything out. A smile immediately appeared on his face. He was interested in how the other guys were doing. Suddenly, the black-haired boy's entire body twitched. An emergency quest appeared. A mutant goblin of rare rank appeared. The protagonist was surprised by such an unexpected appearance, because such a quest should not have happened. Sometime later, our heroes reached a huge entrance to a stone cave. Standing in front of her, the three discussed the fact that they were nervous, and the black-haired boy himself understood them perfectly. Kaiser thought that while they were on their way here, thanks to the extra hunting, they had managed to raise the level of the entire group. Looking inside, Kaiser thought that this dungeon is called a beginner's crusher. The first time you enter it, death is guaranteed. Demo versions of Raid, Tomb of Artie. Among all its names, there is not a single one that gives hope. Compared to normal goblins, this one was incredibly difficult, and special mechanics that require team play. A combination of these two factors. This place made it a crushing ground for newcomers. And it was here that our heroes went. When they went inside, they heard those leaving discussing how it was completely impossible to complete this, asking to do it solo. A girl from our main character's group, having heard these discussions, said that they would have a very difficult time. However, the commander was going to pass, because if they turned around now, then there would be nothing for them to do in the next raids. Hearing these words from the tank of their group, Kaiser thought that the boy had noticed everything correctly. After all, they even hire people with experience more readily than newbies. It was the same in games. Quests, materials, discovering new regions, and defeating bosses. It was all described in the adventure book. Everything a player does in Godos is recorded in a special book called the Adventure Book, Kaiser suggested. What's possible is that once you've beaten dozens of bosses, it won't be as important. But right now, to get into a group for the boss in the next city, I'll have to grit my teeth and get through it, especially since the boss of the next city, unlike the boss of Ard, was mandatory. It was with these thoughts that the black-haired boy led the group forward. And so, literally a few minutes later, they came up against huge doors, and a notification immediately popped up. It was the lair of a goblin warrior. Turning to the group with a smile on his face, Kaiser said that it was time for them to go inside. They, in turn, exhaled heavily, trying to prepare themselves for a tough fight. They reread the tactics more than 10 times for victory, and then, literally a second later, there was real silence between them. Suddenly, they turned their attention to some sounds, but did not attach any importance to it. The leader of the group moved towards the door first, placing his hand on the stone door. With a heavy head, he said that it was time for them to go. And at that very moment, his hand began to glow. Immediately, a notification window popped up in front of the other group members, informing them that their group leader was about to enter the boss's lair. The system asked whether the other participants would agree to enter with him, to which he received an immediate positive response. At that very moment, after everyone had agreed, the door began to open, releasing the terrifying aura that had been hiding inside. Clenching his fists, Kaiser thought about how he hadn't warmed up for a long time. There was a smile on his face, and then, literally a few moments later, the door was completely open. The group immediately rushed forward, but their steps were slow. From this moment, they were on guard. But as soon as they took a few steps from the door, torches began to light, and in the distance of the room, a creature appeared holding a sword. It was the same mutant goblin warrior with 20,000 health points. Naturally, the boss immediately noticed the people who had entered, and a terrifying smile appeared on his face. Without waiting for the first attack, he roared loudly, his roar echoing throughout the room. The pointed boulders hanging from above seemed about to fall straight down. The group was immediately scared because it was the first time they met an elite boss. Some of them couldn't even believe that it was just a game. But their conversation was interrupted by the Kaiser, who loudly shouted that he was advancing. And as soon as the trio looked towards the boss, they saw the goblin already approaching them. The shield, looking at Kaiser, thought that no matter how cool he was, the boy couldn't cover the three of them forever, so they had to give it their all. At the very least, he was trying to ease Kaiser's burden by making sure he could defend himself against the boss. The leader was about to give it his all right now. Seeing the strange behavior from the boss, the leader shouted at the group to scatter. At that moment, the entire trio standing behind jumped back in different directions, and only the tank remained standing, holding up a shield in front of itself. He thought to himself that it was time for the first phase, the breakthrough. By ducking, he was able to dodge the monster's powerful attack, causing it to slam into the wall behind him. The mutant goblin was stunned for 2 seconds after hitting the wall head-on. The commander, realizing this, immediately gave the order to his group to attack, and they immediately followed the order of their commander. The attacks hit their target, striking the monster's body, and a powerful explosion was heard, raising a column of dust behind it. However, as soon as she fell asleep, the face of the monster appeared, carefully examining each person standing in front of her. The leader's gaze locked with the monster's, causing the group's tank to become covered in goosebumps. However, due to his being taken aback, he missed the attack from the Goblin Titan. But still, at the very last moment, he was able to take cover behind his shield. Using the defense skill, he increased his defensive stats, trying to hold back the boss's onslaught. Turning to his allies, he immediately shouted for them to stop attacking him. At that very moment, our main character joined the fight, delivering several blows to the boss with incredible speed. Because of the pain, the goblin began to scream in pain. At that very second, the next attacks were rushing towards him. Another explosion rang out, raising a thick column of dust which left the boss stunned. Watching this, Shield was happy, because everything was going according to his plan, and if everything continued like this, they would be able to pass the first phase. The archer immediately shouted to the commander that the phase change was about to happen. But the Shield did not understand these words. Thinking about the fact that the phase change occurs when health drops to 10,000, suddenly he noticed that the boss's behavior had changed again. His body was covered in a terrifying aura, and he had thrown down his sword, preparing to attack. Seeing his comrade in trouble, Kaiser jumped off the ground and rushed towards the goblin. Having struck a precise blow to his hand in which he held the sword, thereby protecting the commander, blood began to fly in all directions. Kaiser's attack seemed to cut through the air. His power was truly incredible. This time, the boss's screams were painful. He felt pain. The leader himself looked at the bleeding boss with a surprised look, and then he turned his gaze to his black-haired comrade, who cold-bloodedly defended him. The main character himself was smiling at this time, because this time the phase was completed. The girl asked the black-haired guy if he could tell her the secret of his success, since his group was the first to defeat the boss, to which the dark-haired boy, sitting opposite the fair-haired girl, replied that it was all because everyone was good at their own thing. But the girl continued, saying that the usual standard composition of a group is a tank, damage dealer, healer, and support. There should be 4 of them. However, Kaiser's party didn't have a tank, and she couldn't understand how they managed to go on raids at all. Lost in thought, the main character didn't even know how to immediately answer this question. Having said that, the tank must fight the boss one-on-one, identify all of his phases and attack patterns, and also take all the damage on himself. This was an irreplaceable person. So this person was himself. The fair-haired girl was surprised by such an answer, but the main character's face was confident. He was absolutely not lying. And right now, the main character was performing this very role of a tank. Observing what was happening, the group leader could not verify with his own eyes, because such a thing was impossible. I thought to myself that even tanks had a hard time interrupting patterns with their control skills, but Kaiser did it easily. Without using any crowd control effects, he couldn't believe it was a damage dealer doing this. While he stood there immersed in his own thoughts, the protagonist continued to fight the boss. During the fight, a smile was visible on his face. He enjoyed participating in fights. And then one of the attacks reached the monster, and blood again flew in different directions. The archer and the female mage were discussing the fact that their comrade was hitting precisely the pain points. They had never seen this before. In turn, the leader did not take his surprised gaze off the boss's hit points. At some point, he noticed that the boss's health had dropped by up to 20%. Realizing that the second phase was about to begin, he immediately shouted to his comrades to prepare for the next phase. They immediately began to carry out their commander's orders, preparing for battle. The system immediately notified that the boss's health had dropped to 20%, adding that the goblin had activated a characteristic. The monster's entire body began to be covered in a scarlet aura, gradually gaining muscle. He grew in size, and the Goblin Warrior characteristic was activated. All of the Goblin Warrior's stats have been increased, and the Mutant stat has been activated. The Mutant characteristic, unlike the usual characteristics, granted each boss unique abilities. Among them, the characteristic received by the Warrior of the Goblin Mutants was a rule, popularly known as a counting rhyme. The system explained that when physical damage was dealt 4 or more times in a row, the entire party would receive a debuff. And when magical damage is dealt 3 or more times in a row, All damage is returned to the attackers. Each member of the group felt a terrifying aura that spread throughout the room. The system also added that due to the warrior stats frenzy effect, players' attack and movement speeds are reduced by 4%. Kaiser's group members were at a loss as to how to deal with the boss while they were under the effects of debuffs, while the main character himself was immune. Seeing this message, a smile appeared on his face. He was happy, because debuffs did not affect him. The group commander asked his comrades not to panic and not to attack haphazardly, asking them to first focus on evasion. Turning to the black-haired boy, he asked him if the same effects had been cast on him. However, the Kaiser stood with the utmost ease, asking his comrades to stand aside. And then, covered in a terrifying aura similar to the boss, he said in a creepy voice that he would quickly deal with the goblin. Looking towards his comrade, the black-haired commander could not answer him. Not expecting any answers from his comrades, Kaiser rushed towards the boss. The mutant goblin warrior himself waited for the attack, preparing to attack the attacker. However, the protagonist was able to easily repel the attacker's attack with his blade. The boy's face didn't indicate at all that he was going to lose this fight. Increasing his speed, he began to slide around the goblin, delivering attacks. The protagonist's younger comrades did not understand why the negative effects did not affect their comrade. The squad leader didn't understand what was happening right now, not realizing that he wasn't an apostle of a forgotten god. In addition, looking at our boy, he thought that right now he only looked like one guy. Watching the main character fight, Best Shield thought that the black-haired man looked like a warrior god. The main character himself was enjoying the battle at this time. While defending himself, he blocked every attack of the monster, immediately turning his defense into an attack, delivering precise blows to the monster. While the boss was dealing one attack, the protagonist would deal several counterattacks at once. And so, the name Kaiser got stuck in the head of the detachment commander. This name did not leave his head. At that very second, the boss screamed with anger and pain. The goblin could not believe that he was losing to one person. But Kaiser had no intention of turning the fight into a team effort, intending to deal with the boss alone. Time after time he attacked, blood flying in all directions. At some point, it seemed that it covered the entire area. A thick smell of blood began to hang in the air. The black-haired boy's face looked calm, without any emotions. The aura around the guy gradually became more and more terrifying. At the same time, the system notified the protagonist about level increases and increased swordsmanship, and also that thanks to the 7th level of sword mastery, sword damage is increased by 7%. And so, having increased his speed to the maximum, he approached the monster, and in the next moment he found himself completely behind it. The system notified that, thanks to the Fury effect, the boss is dealt 10% additional damage. And at that very moment, the boy delivered a powerful, precise blow to the mutant goblin warrior. The roar rang out for the last time, and the monster's entire body was cut open. Gradually, the roar died down, and the boss himself fell to the ground, still continuing to bleed. The system notified that the boss had been defeated, meaning the dungeon had been cleared. The protagonist's comrades could not believe their eyes, because a real miracle had just happened before their eyes. The leader spoke in a trembling voice so that they would listen to him about the Kaiser. He suggested in a surprised voice that this was the very same real Kaiser from Demrock. In turn, his comrades could not believe this and asked about it again in surprise. However, they did not wait for an answer to this question, looking with their mouths open in surprise towards the black-haired boy. At that very moment, the main character himself was standing on the back of the defeated boss, looking towards his comrades. The system notified that the Best Shield group took first place in clearing the boss. Kaiser himself took first place in completing this quest, and according to the level of merit, they were entitled to a reward. The main character received red leather armor, shoulder pads, a two-handed sword, and the Prince Throne of speedrunning. Also, all of the main character's characteristics were increased by 5 points. Listening to all these awards, the more of them there were, the bigger and bigger the smile on the black-haired boy's face became. Releasing a terrifying aura and with an equally terrifying face, he said that goblins are best chopped into cabbage. And so, approaching his comrades, Kaiser saw that they were studying the notice without interrupting them. They were happy because they had received heroic ranks, and each member of the group received the rarest rewards. The duo shouted loudly, thanking Kaiser, because if it weren't for him, they couldn't even dream of such rewards. The boy himself, with a smile on his face, replied that it was all thanks to them. Suddenly, a rather rough voice from the squad commander tore them away from their pleasant conversation. Approaching the guy, he lowered his head, asking if he wanted to look at the name listed in the ranking. He apologized because his name was in the ranking, saying that he should have changed the name at the very beginning, and he was very sorry about it. The boy himself thought that even getting to the first place in the ranking was a great privilege. After all, thanks to this achievement, they might even be invited to join one of the 10 great guilds. Even though it was just a dungeon in the starting town, they still wrote their names into the ranking history. On top of all this, these guys even outdid the liquidator himself. The commander distracted the guy from these thoughts again, continuing to apologize for the inconvenience, intending to compensate for it. Hearing all these words, a smile appeared on the black-haired boy's face. Still with the same smile and sweet voice, he told the black-haired man that everything was okay. After all, he understood everything perfectly well, since the name of the group leader is automatically included in the ranking anyway. He added that he didn't expect them to take first place, thinking to himself that it didn't matter what name was in the ranking. After all, public attention will only bring problems, and the most important thing at the moment is awards. For this fight, he was able to receive a warrior set. These were the best items that could be obtained at this stage of development, and since he received such things, he had no reason to complain. He giggled with a terrifying expression, holding his head, which frightened his comrades, who asked if everything was really okay. Suddenly, the boy was distracted from his own thoughts, changing to his usual face, loudly, declaring that everything was fine, asking them not to apologize to him. They began to thank the boy again, saying that they would now be devoted to him until death. Thinking to themselves that Kaiser was on a different level, the system immediately activated the portal, announcing that the session would end in a few seconds. Shield approached Ugin, saying that when he read about the laudatory posts about Kaiser, he thought that they were all greatly exaggerated. But now he understood who the real Kaiser was, what real strength was. Stopping just before the portal, Kaiser turned to his comrades, asking if they weren't coming back. They immediately rushed towards the blue portal, because they did not intend to stay here. And so, the entire Shield group entered the portal, leaving this session. Sometime later, our protagonist found himself in the slums of Arda. The rest of the trio appeared around him, surprised that it was completely different here during the day. The main character himself, looking around, noticed something. His gaze was caught by one detail. He looked carefully towards the man in the black cloak sitting at the bar. It was Kalde. He was an alchemist, who asked the group in a rough voice who they were. Ujin and the girl noticed that he was an unpleasant guy, but the commander asked them not to judge people by their appearance. Coming closer, Kaiser tried to speak, but he was interrupted by the other man, who said that he hoped that they had not come to surrender, and then adding that he needed a lot of blood for his research. At that very moment, the protagonist placed the flask of blood on the table, surprising the alchemist. After all, he recognized the blood of a mutant goblin. He couldn't believe that they were able to bring it. After all, only about 40 minutes had passed. Having struck their most suggestive poses, the group said that everything was exactly as the alchemist thought. The man's face immediately turned red, and he said that it was incredible that they were able to defeat this mutant so quickly. The entire group's level increased. They passed the 0 test, which did not record ratings, and now the heroes could go to the main continent. Everyone was happy because now they could go to the main continent. At that very moment, the protagonist received a special reward, deciding that he would deal with it a little later. Now he was interested in something else, because this is what he was waiting for most of all after the Pantheon. The call. Immediately, a low-ranking summoning ticket appeared in front of the main character. As soon as he pressed it, bright rays began to fly out of it in different directions. Several cards hung in the sky. Looking at them, the boy thought that compared to the Pantheon, it didn't look impressive. Without thinking twice, the black-haired Kaiser immediately activated the Eye of Truth, his eyes filling with bright energy. Thinking that these are low-ranking tickets, there will be nothing special among them. And so, he received the skill of Roars and Swing. The rank is normal. He thought that it was a good skill. After all, he had used it often back in Demrock. But that wasn't the most important thing now. A ticket that could drop anything from a common to a legendary item. But once it was used, the system announced a limit, and then she added that a forced exit would now occur. The boy was surprised by such notification windows. Session time limit. A system designed to keep players immersed in the incredibly realistic world of Godos. Having not forgotten about reality and not died of exhaustion, the protagonist could not believe that 10 whole hours had already passed. The system counted down 5 seconds, but the cards did not change their color. The black-haired boy's face was covered in sweat. He couldn't wait to see what was in store for him, and then the card began to glow yellow, emitting a pleasant and powerful aura. Grabbing the notification window, the black-haired Kaiser screamed at the top of his voice, and at that very moment, the system announced the end of the session. The map continued to be in front of the protagonist's eyes. He clenched his teeth in anger, not believing that he hadn't noticed what had happened to him. However, he gradually came to his senses, remembering that he had been transferred to reality. Opening his eyes, he noticed that it was already quite dark around. He himself lay in that very capsule, and he replayed what had happened in his head several times. With each passing second, his face changed more and more. And then, unable to bear it any longer, he screamed in anger throughout the entire capsule. And so, gradually the next day arrived. The boy could barely fall asleep. Sitting on the chair, every part of his body was shaking. He couldn't find his place. Constantly glancing at the time, it was finally exactly 10 o'clock. Seeing this, he thought he wouldn't live to see the entry limit passed. He immediately opened the capsule and jumped into it, preparing to return to the game. The game started loading, checking the retinas of the eyes, and then the player's ID. And so, literally a moment later, the main character found himself in the very place where the game ended. Standing on the street, he couldn't wait to find out what had befallen him. When activating the system window, it was not lowered by that same yellow light. And so, the system announced that the guy had an unverified skill. Looking into the storage, he saw it. It was a skill, an attack from behind, although he thought it was legendary. But the skill turned out to be ordinary. This was the signature skill of the assassins, the main reason why ranged damage dealers feared them. No matter how much you distance yourself, this crazy skill allows you to instantly be close. With a lewd smile, Kaiser couldn't believe that this skill had been given to him. He understood that with such skills, he could become the perfect damage dealer who would destroy everyone. At that very moment, a guy was walking by and grabbing something from a girl walking next to him. The main character himself stood at this time, immersed in his own thoughts. Suddenly, this same fair-haired guy noticed the black-haired guy standing in front of him. Stopping, they began to peer at the black-haired man. Seeing the terrifying expression and the killing aura that this player was releasing, they got scared, thinking that a psychopath was standing in front of them. The girl asked the guy to go another way. Turning around, they rushed up the stairs, deciding that it was really better to avoid this psycho. The main character himself, noticing the fleeing people, did not understand why they had such a reaction to him. However, he didn't think about it for long, thinking that now was the time to use the clothes. After all, with such goodness, he would no longer look like a newbie. Now, in such equipment, he was going to go to the mainland. And now the system has notified that after moving to the main continent, it will be impossible to return to Arda. Entering the portal, the protagonist remembered that he had not said goodbye to his comrades. I even thought about the fact that during this time I had managed to get used to them. He felt sorry, but he blamed it all on the fact that, if it was fate, they would definitely meet again. And so, having entered the portal, he came out on the main continent in one of the cities. All the players who had completed their training in Arda. Full of bright hopes, we set foot on the main continent for the first time. Unlike Arda, where the servers are divided by country, this is where everyone gathers together and forms groups. And the first point on this path was Raven, the very first city. Immediately, shouts were heard on the street asking for people to make way, as Raven's knights had returned from their mission. They were leading a tied-up guy who was screaming at them to let him go immediately. The system itself notified the guy that previously blocked systems were now available, and the newbie bonuses were cancelled. She asked the new player to enjoy the horizons of the main continent, asking that crimes be reported to the guards. Reading these notices, Kaiser was shocked, because it is not for nothing that they say that the real game begins only on the mainland. Immediately, a man approached the main character, asking him to come in and try their beer, which was the pride of the city. Other men followed him, praising their food. Looking at them, the main character thought that now everything was clear. He understood why people give up hunting and just walk around the city. After slapping himself in the face several times, he asked himself to pull himself together, because the fun could wait. Stretching his limbs, the black-haired boy was about to go hunting. And so, sometime later, he was already swinging his blade with all his might. The main character went to the Raven Plains to kill monsters to level up. The effect of the warrior set was that damage against goblins was increased by 7%, and all stats were increased by 2 points. The main character thought to himself that there was no better gear against goblins. The set scared the goblins, breaking their fighting spirit, making them tremble with fear. The protagonist in turn made full use of his new skills. As you slashed at goblins, gaining more and more points, the set provided additional damage, making it much easier to slash at goblins. Due to all this, the pumping speed was increased several times. The protagonist exuded a terrifying aura that frightened every monster within a few meters. Finally, the system notified that the Red Greatsword's attack power had been increased. The kid was really into this set, thinking that he already had high stats and now he got some extra ones. His happiness knew no bounds. He could not enjoy his luck this time. However, He noticed that the quests were progressing slowly, and there was very little time left before leveling up. Suddenly, something caught his attention, and he immediately glanced back. With the help of the Eye of Truth, he noticed an armed man approaching him. To himself, the man thought about the warrior's set on the black-haired man, believing that better prey had not yet been invented. Gripping his blade tighter, he was about to launch an attack at our protagonist. Having wished himself a bon appetit, he was about to attack the black-haired man from behind. At the very last moment, the black-haired man grabbed his sword, blocking the attacker's attack. Immediately, the power that covered the black-haired man began to subside. He didn't even understand what happened. Suddenly, the main character turned towards him, releasing a terrifying aura, and asked what he had just tried to do. The attacker immediately jumped back a few meters, increasing the distance from our main character, shouting loudly, "Why did everyone freeze?" ordering to attack the guy in the warrior's set. At that moment, a guy holding a bow jumped into the air and launched several magic arrows. But the main character repelled these attacks with ease, only throwing his sword over his head. Following the attack, a big guy appeared holding an axe, intending to chop up the black-haired man. However, our main character was able to easily block this attack, throwing the attacker's weapon into the ground, thereby disarming the big guy. And then, catching himself, he threw his sword behind his back. With a slight movement, he cut the attacker, thereby killing him. The other two were quite surprised by this turn of events. After all, they didn't expect that something like this could happen at all. It was supposed to be easy prey. The assassin thought to himself that this couldn't be happening, because in front of them was an ordinary noob. At that moment, the protagonist used his new skill, appearing right in front of the fleeing man. Stopping in front of the main character, the attacker began to raise his head, trembling. Seeing the terrifying face that was releasing a killing aura, he asked with a smile if he was really lost. Wherever you are, there will always be those who do not want to obey. And in games, it is exactly the same. We are not talking about official PvP in arenas right now, and about merciless slaughter. In other words, players who make a living by killing other players. There were such players in Demrock, and in Godos, the situation hasn't changed at all. For fun, for profit, or just to annoy, there can be many reasons. But if you ask who is the worst of them, 9 out of 10 will answer: gankers. Those who kill players who have barely left the starting village and clean them out blind. Just like this guy standing right now in front of our main character. This is not the first time Kaiser has encountered such players, so the reaction to his appearance was appropriate. The black-haired ganker couldn't believe that this was a rear entry skill. He didn't understand how a swordsman could use this skill, but his thoughts didn't last long. And so, sometime later, the system began to notify Kaiser about player murders. The player's data was identified as villains, so the system accepted the protagonist's actions as self-defense. Therefore, the karma indicator will not increase. Listening to these notifications, the guy thought that in this game everything is the same as in Demrock. However, RD, with its bonuses for newcomers, was an exception, beginning to remember the past. He thought back to his first group in this game, thinking that those guys had been unusually kind to him. But the reality was much worse, because it was such that there were only scumbags around. The main character, Kaiser, was about to go collect loot and receive a reward for the quest. And so, sometime later, the black-haired boy was able to reach the Western Gate, the Western Forest of Raven. That's where the main character went, a dangerous hunting zone that even NPCs avoid, discouraging players from going there. Unlike the vast plains at the Eastern Gates, the situation at the Western Gates was different. Here, everything is overgrown with dense thickets, limiting the view for the eyes. Not only goblins swarm here, but also hordes of giant insects, starting with sudden ambushes from either a single goblin or a whole horde, ending with creatures attacking from behind trees and rocks, sitting in ambush until the very end. Because of this, the difficulty of the Western Forest is prohibitively high, which has given rise to an unspoken rule of this eerie place. The group sent there had to consist of at least 3 members. That's why there are always crowds of people in front of the Western Gates, and our main character ended up in this place. Each person was looking for someone specifically. Someone needed help with leveling. Someone needed a tank in the group. Someone needed a damage dealer. A group of 3 young men were looking for a healer, not understanding where they all went, to which the yellow-haired man told his comrades that healers were always in short supply, because they were boring to play and hard to level up. Suddenly, the big guy pointed into the distance, asking the rest of his comrades to look into the distance. Looking at our protagonist walking alone, they called him a mad suicide bomber, considering him an upstart. The others supported him, because even the top guys mostly go there in a group, because the chance is always high. Continuing to watch him go, they couldn't understand what this black-haired man was hoping for by going to such a terrible place alone. Listening to these conversations, Kaiser exhaled heavily with a smile on his face. And so, in that very place, he cut down crowds of goblins left and right. He wasn't going to leave any of them alive. There was already an unpleasant smell in the air, and now it was mixed with the smell of blood. The goblins, in turn, did not just attack head-on, but also tried to catch the man in a mistake by attacking him from behind. But our main character didn't take first place in the ranking in the last game for nothing. He was always on the alert. Therefore, he easily dodged these so-called surprise attacks. And so, one of these goblin attacks failed. Now he was prey. The monster flew into the ground with great force, flying up and hitting the ground several times. The monster's entire body was shaking with pain. He could not rise from the ground due to the wounds he had received, but no one was going to leave him alive. So the main character came up and finished him off. And at that very moment, when he killed the man lying down, 2 arrows flew towards him. With an instant reaction, he responded to them. Grabbing his sword, he was able to deflect the arrows. Naturally, the goblin was shocked by this, because at some point he smelled the scent of victory. The black-haired boy looked at his attacker with horror, releasing a thirst for blood. An instant later, the protagonist's sword flew towards the archer, covering the distance clearly faster than the monster's reaction. And then, a second later, the blood splattered in all directions, and the bough fell to the ground. Kaiser's blade struck the tree trunk with incredible force, causing the earth to shake. At that very moment, the system deactivated the warrior set's effect, and the next wave of goblins appeared behind the protagonist. They giggled loudly, preparing to attack the black-haired man right now. With a smile on his face, the protagonist summoned his weapon, thinking that with such an opponent he didn't need a set. Looking around, Kaiser began to release energy using the skill Go Behind the Back. Immediately his body became covered with energy, gradually beginning to move the black-haired boy. One of the goblins sensed something was wrong and looked behind him. However, it was already too late, because our boy delivered his blow, cutting the red one. At that very moment, all the goblins standing there set out to avenge their comrade. This is what the boy was hoping for. He began to cut down the monsters one after another. Loud cries of pain were heard all around, and blood continued to cover the ground. While chopping up the monsters, the main character thought that the axe in his hands felt quite good. In turn, the system did not stop for a second, continuing to notify about the murders. And so, sometime later, the screams died down. The black-haired man returned for his sword, pulling it out of the tree trunk. Looking at the system window, Kaiser thought that the goblin quest was over. Suddenly, he was distracted from his thoughts by a loud sound that appeared quite suddenly. Turning his head back, he saw a monster that was clearly not in a friendly mood. The monster's mouth was covered in a disgusting liquid, which in turn had an unpleasant smell. Looking at this huge creature, the protagonist's expression changed. He was clearly unhappy with the current situation. A loud sound began to be heard in the forest. It was the sound of a battle. Our main character was being chased by that same huge monster, intending to devour the guy. Noticing that the centipede had slowed down, Kaiser also stopped. Regrouping, he screamed, tired of running away from her. So he immediately turned to her, grabbing his blade and throwing it behind his back. Immediately, the guy's eyes lit up scarlet, and the black-haired man once again began to feel a thirst for blood. The creature itself was surprised, because it did not expect that a person could emit such thirst. The boy's speed exceeded the creature's reaction, so the man was able to easily attack it, green blood rising into the air. This wound only made her angry. She squealed loudly, spraying her drool. And then she hit the ground, raising a full column of dust, forcing the black-haired boy to retreat several meters back. The protagonist stopped and froze, waiting for his opponent to take action. And so it happened. The centipede rushed to attack first, emitting the same vile scream. Kaiser was surprised that such a rather large creature could move so quickly while he was thinking about it. The monster had already gotten close to him, forcing the boy to raise his sword in front of him in defense. Gritting his teeth, the black-haired man was angry because the centipede was putting out quite a bit of pressure. Her strength was commensurate with her size. Having pushed the monster back a bit, he called up a system window, summoning the axe with which he had recently been chopping down goblins left and right. What infuriated him was that not only was he ugly, but he also stuck his face in everywhere. At some point, the black-haired man managed to launch an attack, causing the ugly woman to scream in pain and spray her blood. However, our main character was not going to stop there. He threw his sword behind his back. Coming closer, he swung it with a light movement, cutting down the huge one. Gradually, the screams died down. The monster, covered in its own blood, fell to the ground. The system immediately notified the guy that he had killed the monster, and his sword skill had increased to 10th. And following him, the player's level also increased. After the second battle in a row, The black-haired one got a little tired, so he decided to take a break and study his stats. His current level was 19, and he had raised 2 levels in one battle. Although it was a bit difficult, the main character's level increased quite quickly. In addition to this, most of the quests were completed. Continuing to look through the system window, the black-haired boy thought, because now there was only one regular rank quest left. At the Western Gate, not that the quest was particularly difficult, our protagonist continues to reflect. After resting a bit, he set off on his journey, since the location had become known, so all he had to do was go and collect the reward. Sometime later, he reached a crowd where a man was shouting for everyone to get in line and respect each other's time. At some point, there were even quarrels, and our main character came out to one of them. Looking at the tree, Kaiser thought that this pendant had melted at this very tree where people had gathered. Looking around, he was glad, because the line was not so long. Because if there were more people, he would have to wait a long time. Suddenly, the protagonist's attention was drawn to conversations about the noob killer being hunted, and he listened to them. A couple of men were discussing how the bastard nicknamed Killer had been declared a hunted man. They believed that he deserved it, since he had been showing off. The yellow-haired man, giggling in turn, said that he had heard someone chatting about the famous Kaiser. The main character immediately tensed up because he didn't understand why his name had surfaced so suddenly. The armored man dismissed it as just a fan, while the yellow-haired man continued to talk about a swordsman who used assassin skills. But the boy in armor just laughed, because he couldn't believe it, just like the others. Hearing this, the protagonist came to the conclusion that he would have to lie low. A swordsman who used assassin skills. And with 6 stats, he understood that the top guilds wouldn't leave him alone that easily. Some will, of course, try to lure him away, but most will simply want to get rid of the future threat, especially if the top guilds are full of people from the Democrats. Because it's simple. If you can't get it, you have to destroy it. This was quite in the spirit of the previous game, and sometime later, the main character got hold of the lost pendant. The system asked him to return it to Camilla. Thinking it was too early to show up, he returned to Raven, finding the same Camilla from the quest. The girl rejoiced, thanking the protagonist for being able to return her pendant. The quest was successfully completed. The reward was 1 gold, experience, and a small gift from Camilla. And the player's level was also increased. While handing over the box, the girl said that it was her favorite thing. But because Kaiser was kind, she was giving it to him. Taking it, Kaiser thanked the girl for the gift, asking her not to lose it again. At that very moment, the effect of the title Maximum Sympathy from the very beginning was activated, where Camilla's sympathy quickly increased. While the girl was saying goodbye to her brother, the main character, leaving, was surprised at how quickly their sympathy was growing. Opening the system window, he was about to look at the next quest. Seeing a quest where they give a whole coupon, he realized that this was probably not something he could miss. If we talk about the dungeons behind the Western Gate, there are 2 main ones, the Goblin Chieftain's Abode and the Ant Hole. Each of them was considered a creepy place. If he wants to build a warrior set, then the best place to go is the Goblin. However, the problem is that both of these dungeons required a group. It's probably too early for him to show off his unique abilities to a crowd of unfamiliar players. And so, sometime later, the main character came to the dwelling of the Goblin leader. As usual, there was a crowd of people who were calling players to their groups. Some were looking for mages. Some were taking players from a certain level. Others simply bought junk at high prices. Others repaired weapons. The main character, looking at them, was surprised, because even crafters had gathered in such a place. And so, he noticed how one of the guys in armor rudely answered the guy that they do not take bandits. At some point, an argument even started between them, because another guy in armor joined in. Near them, a crowd surrounded the girl, asking the magician to go with their group. After observing the situation for a while, the main character realized that everyone here was looking for magicians. Remembering that in Godot's everything depended on the boss's stats, class inequality was the norm here. In this dungeon, the magician was king and god. But the problem was that even a swordsman was absolutely useless here. Suddenly, he was distracted from his thoughts by a click. Someone called him, calling him a guy in the Warriors Network. A young man approached and asked if the main character would like to join his group, explaining that they were high levels and that they had come here simply for the quest, so it didn't matter that he was a swordsman. Lost in thought, the black-haired boy realized that something was wrong here and decided to play along with them a little. Clutching his head, Kaiser replied that if they didn't mind, he would be happy to join their group. As soon as Kaiser accepted the invitation, he immediately saw their levels. All 3 were level 24. At that very moment, our boy realized that this situation meant only one thing. They recognized him, so they approached him so sweetly to invite him to join their group. A moment before, the same trio noticed a black-haired boy standing out from the crowd. They noticed him because of his set and his two-handed sword, assuming that this was the same Kaiser. A sinister smile immediately appeared on their commander's face, considering that the sight before them was not a happy one. So they immediately approached him, calling him, although they had no intention of indicating that they recognized this set. When they approached, they pretended to be cute players who hadn't been appointed and had come up with a question about joining the group. And they didn't pay any attention to the fact that in front of them stood a swordsman, and not a mage, who was required to complete this quest. Even though the main character guessed that he was being invited to the group for a reason, he agreed, because he also needed to complete this quest. And so, upon entering the cave, the system notified all participants that they had entered the abode of a goblin chieftain, a rare rank. And so the main character's new team entered the battle, starting to exterminate the goblin scouts. The system notified that the scout's death had become known to the leader. The two guys silently discussed how easy it was. After watching the battle, Kaiser thought that the trio was not bad. The damage was decent, and the group's coherence was also high. The system added some time later that the frightened leader sends out his soldiers, asking the players to prepare for battle. In the distance, a huge number of red eyes appeared. They were monsters that were making disgusting sounds. Turning to the boy, the trio asked the boy if he wanted to try to deal with them himself this time, adding that if he gets into trouble, they will help him, deciding at the same time to try how they can work together. The main character thought to himself that these three had simply decided to test what he was capable of. Deciding that there was no other option but to play along, he headed towards the monsters, grabbing his weapon. Concentrating, he used a roar and a swing, heading towards the monsters at incredible speed. Having immediately begun to cut them to the right and left, gradually the entire earth began to be covered in scarlet. It was the color of blood. With satisfied grins, the two guys thought that it was definitely him. They thought that they were finally able to find him. The commander turned to his partner and asked him how he was, to which he replied that Kaiser was not bad. He added that he skillfully avoided blows to vital points and was quite fast for a two-handed sword. After thinking for a bit, the commander said that with such gear and such a zone, he would hardly have given in to anyone. However, his comrade interrupted him, saying that this was all too strange, which the commander did not understand, asking again, not understanding how their assassin had lost. After all, he was not strong and fast enough to kill their comrade. After all, for an assassin with invisibility and poison to lose, one of the best classes for PvP. The magician standing behind them intervened and said that it made no difference, since their task was simply to finish him off. Throwing all thoughts aside, the commander agreed with the girl with a smile on his face, saying that they should sort it out and wash their hands of this. The tank raised his shield with a smile, asking his comrades if it was time to start. The commander asked them to watch their comrades' faces and act according to the old plan. The big guy asked them not to worry. At this time, our main character continued to fight against the goblins, cutting them down, covering the cave more and more with blood. Running up, the commander said with a satisfied face that the boy really was cool. The others who approached also noticed the black-haired man's strength, because they came to help him, but he managed without their help. To which our protagonist countered their statements by saying that they were also good in combat. They began to discuss among themselves how lucky they were to have found such a professional in their group. The main character thought to himself that they had abandoned their teammate alone in the thick of battle, and were behaving so brazenly after such a dirty trick. They can abandon him at any moment, and if he dies, they will probably get their hands on the main character's gear. After taking a rest, the commander suggested moving on, since they had already stood in one place for too long. Looking towards the main character with a terrifying gaze, the commander thought that he would kill him at the first opportunity. In turn, the main character felt this, also changing his face, thinking that it would not be easy for him to do this. Moving further, the commander was the first to enter the battle, starting to cut down the goblins. The group's tank followed suit, crushing the cave monsters with its strength. An explosion came from behind the main character, and one of the goblins flew straight towards him. The commander, noticing this, immediately shouted at the girl, telling her to aim properly. In turn, the trio thought that the guy had good luck, because the girl was aiming at the guy, but right at that moment a goblin jumped out. The main character thought to himself that he had even deliberately exposed his back to them, but they still missed. After thinking a little more, he decided to wait a little longer, and at this pace they reached the boss's chambers. Immediately the system notified that the goblin chieftain had discovered uninvited guests, and a powerful gust of wind was heard. Following the gust of wind, elite red goblin soldiers emerged to try and stop the assassination attempt on the leader. These goblins were an elite class. They were the strongest and most trained fighters among the red goblins. Seeing them, The commander shouted for Kaiser to hold them back until they… However, before he could finish speaking, he fell silent because the Kaiser, who stood in front of them, simply disappeared. Looking around, the commander of this group shouted out asking where this black-haired bastard was. Tank shouted that the little devil had figured it all out, to which their fellow mage asked the boys to look ahead. Turning around, the commander sensed danger approaching, so he immediately grabbed his sword more tightly. At the very last moment, he managed to block a powerful attack from an elite goblin. The tank was also attacked by one of these goblins, forcing him to defend himself. Turning towards the girl, the guy shouted that he would hold him back, asking her to attack them faster. Nodding affirmatively, the red-headed girl began to recite the spell for a fire attack. However, raising her head, she saw how, at that very moment, a huge boulder was flying towards her. After rolling back the spell, she dodged the attack by jumping back a few meters. Turning her gaze towards the huge doors, the girl's gaze changed and fear appeared on her face. And at that very second, there was a loud roar and a huge red leg appeared. And right behind the body, the goblin himself appeared. The system notified that this was the goblin leader, the boss of a rare dungeon. Tank shouted that they would distract him. But at that time, however, he did not have time to finish his thought. After all, he saw that same black-haired member of the group who mysteriously disappeared before the appearance of the elite soldiers. The red-haired girl immediately shouted insults at the guy, asking him how this was even possible. The main character himself walked silently at first, holding his huge sword on his shoulder. But as he came closer, he spoke, talking about that assassin kid. Releasing a terrifying aura, he asked if he and the very assassin he killed were really friends. While the two guys held off the elites, the girl asked the guy to wait, saying that they were indeed his enemies, but first they needed to clear the dungeon. After all, in any case, they will only be able to pass it if they fight together. The main character replied that this really is reasonable. The girl continued to say that the guy had made a wise decision, but with every word the blood from her mouth grew larger and larger. Looking down, she saw the same black-haired boy thrust his blade into her body, still with the same terrifying face. With a treacherous smile and thirst for blood like the bosses, the main character said that he didn't want to. The system notified that the guy killed a player nicknamed the Greatest Archmage, and the system identified him as a villain. After thinking it over a bit, he decided to first use an approach from the rear, and then he was quite surprised because he even managed to get behind the corpse. The squad leader screamed because the guy had gone crazy, killing the only mage in the group, deciding that Kaiser had decided to die here with them. But the main character didn't think so. And with a smile on his face, he asked if he knew what his credo was. Surprised, the man shouted, asking the black-haired man again, because he didn't understand anything. And the main character, having activated the summoning of weapons, said that he was not going to have anything to do with those who were aiming at his back. In that same hand, a dagger appeared in his hands, releasing a thirst for blood. He said that if he only got involved with such people, everything would inevitably go to waste. Seeing the weapon that appeared, the squad leader was surprised, because it was an assassin's dagger. He did not understand what Kaiser was going to do with it. Seeing such a reaction, the main character smiled, because the commander immediately recognized his friend's thing. In turn, the commander shouted that this was nonsense, because how could a swordsman use this weapon? But he immediately dismissed these thoughts, shouting and asking what he was hoping for, because if he killed them, he wouldn't be able to cope with them alone. He wondered if Kaiser knew what the goblin chieftain's stat was aimed at. Selfish defense. It was against physical attack. That's why in this dungeon, mages are the top tier. And now the black-haired one is just an ordinary nobody with a dagger in his hands. Without answering the commander, who was screaming in fear, the main character said, "Status effect." And then, with a satisfied face, he asked him what he thought the status effect was related to. But he thought the guy was crazy, because he was going to kill him with ordinary bleeding from a weapon. The protagonist, in turn, didn't think so, because now the situation would turn out completely differently than they could even imagine. Naturally, the commander of the assassination group was very surprised by this reaction and the Kaiser's subsequent actions. The protagonist began to act with incredible speed, moving around the cave. In an instant, he appeared behind the red elite goblin, waving his dagger. The system immediately notified that the difference in characteristics was overwhelming, so the assassin's dagger effect was activated. Immediately, the boy holding the sword in his hands fell to the ground, clutching his throat, from which blood began to flow. Coughing up blood, the guy didn't understand, since his level was higher, what they could even be talking about. After all, no matter how cool Kaiser's gear was, he was only level 20, not realizing how huge the difference in characteristics was between them. However, the protagonist thought otherwise, because the bleeding man couldn't understand that he had received the bleeding skill from a level 20 coupon. In turn, the protagonist thought that even he was surprised, because the effect was cumulative. In Godos, as in the days of Demrock, status effects from the same class usually do not stack. But who could have known that a psychopath like the main character would appear, using assassin weapons with robber skills? With a trembling voice, still spitting blood, he did not understand what kind of cheating this was. Barely raising his head, experiencing wild pain, he did not stop calling our main character a cheater. Finally falling to the ground, the system notified that the protagonist had killed the player Bastard Swordsman. The system recognized him as a villain. Kaiser let out a heavy sigh and thought about how these guys always had the same excuse. Suddenly, a voice came from behind him. It was Tank's cry, worried about his comrade. Looking at the expression on the big guy's face, the black-haired boy thought that for a moment he had even forgotten about him. The big guy himself didn't understand why everything had turned out this way, not understanding where everything had gone wrong as they had planned. However, looking at Kaiser's expression, he realized that he shouldn't have even gotten involved in this in the first place, thinking that it was time to run before it was too late. But it was already too late. His own blood began to splatter in all directions. Just like with the previous guy, the protagonist found himself behind the elite goblin, still in the same pose with a dagger. Falling to his knees, the tank began to bleed, and the bleeding status effect was also applied to him. The system notified the tank that level 03 had dropped below 10%. He didn't understand what that meant. However, without understanding, he fell to the ground, dying. The system notified the protagonist that he had killed the villain, and so, the system additionally notified the main character that he had killed an elite red goblin. The boy thought to himself that the euro was quite good, but he would have put another 15 points into strength. Watching what was happening, the red goblin chieftain continued to roar, simply watching. He looked carefully at his army, never expecting them to fall so easily. As soon as the brute began to squeal, the system notified that the goblin leader was furious over the death of his subordinates. Due to the notification, the black-haired Kaiser nevertheless turned his gaze to the screaming man. Seeing him running furiously towards him, he thought to himself that he had completely forgotten about the leader. At that very moment, his eyes lit up with a scarlet color, and with a smile on his face, he thought that he was going to have some fun right now. Suddenly, before reaching our main character, the huge body jumped into the air and began flying straight towards Kaiser. These actions amused the black-haired boy. He concentrated his strength in his legs. Jumping straight at the red-skinned monster, he slammed his knee into it. From this powerful blow, the goblin's entire face was covered in blood, and it began to fly in different directions. But our boy wasn't going to stop there, continuing to attack the red brute, ultimately sending him straight to the ground. A loud explosion was heard as soon as he landed. Suddenly, our boy's face changed. He was surprised, because he saw something he didn't expect at all. Dust rose around the creature's body, and the air filled with yellow energy. The system notified that the goblin chieftain's characteristic, selfish defense, had been activated. Returning to his former thirst for blood, the protagonist headed towards the monster. Flying past him at great speed, he made 2 precise cuts all over his body. The monster began coughing up blood. The system notified that level 03 had dropped below 30%, and the bleeding effect had activated. Suddenly, the red-skinned creature felt a strange feeling and immediately turned towards the black-haired man. Noticing how he was draining a terrifying aura that even made him tremble, the main character himself was smiling a terrible smile at that moment, saying that it was high time to finish. Naturally, the monster was scared. He was timid, but he was not going to give up so easily, screaming throughout his chambers. And the next second, he simply ran away, trying to leave this place as quickly as possible. The protagonist wasn't particularly surprised by such actions, so he activated the skill of going behind the lines. Turning around to check where the man was, the goblin was surprised because there was no one behind him. But as soon as he turned his head back, he noticed how Kaiser had moved closer to him. With the same expression on his face that scared even the bosses, the protagonist asked the runner where he was going. The red-headed man's face spoke for itself. The monster was terrified. There was a disgusting sound, and blood splattered in all directions, covering the entire nearby wall. The boss fell to the ground, covered in blood, and the system notified the protagonist of the victory over the boss. The entry was made in the adventure book. Kaiser's level increased, his dagger proficiency level increased to 5, and a leather belt dropped. The boy thought to himself that everything had worked out well, because he had just needed the belt. His strength had immediately increased by 1 point, and his health by 2. With a smile on his face, Kaiser reasoned that if there had been a time limit, he would have made it into the rankings. On top of all this, he glanced back, because there was still some reward left. Approaching the shield, Kaiser examined it carefully. The shield was of a rare class, and it was made of silver. The boy assumed that it was expensive. Next to the shield lay the bastard's training sword, which rather puzzled the protagonist. Remembering his former commander, Kaiser assumed that he had been too much of an avid role player. But that guy's nickname was now worthless. After examining the pendant, the main character thought that it could be sold for good money. Suddenly, he heard some sounds. Immediately activating the Eye of Truth and looking to the side. Looking into the distance, the black-haired boy felt an incomprehensible aura, asking himself only one question. What is it? Assuming that it was hidden, he immediately dismissed these thoughts, because the light was too bright for her. As he got closer, the system notified him that he had discovered a secret dungeon, the hideout of a black goblin shaman. Immediately, a huge portal appeared in front of the main character, which drained a rather frightening force. In addition to this, the system added that Kaiser was the first to discover the secret dungeon, for which he received the title of Skilled Explorer. There are many types of dungeons, from group ones to solo ones and labyrinths, as well as special and event ones. But among them, the rarest and least known are the secret dungeons. They were difficult to find even for players with the explorer profession, because not only were they located in unimaginable places, but they also required special conditions to enter. The system immediately confirmed the conditions in the form of one survivor in the dungeon, the absence of a group. Our protagonist was shocked by this, because in a group dungeon, you need to find a secret entrance alone, without a group. With such conditions, even if you found it, there would be no point. The next moment, a system window appeared in front of the guy. The shelter had a heroic rank. Kaiser could not miss such an opportunity. Fried, who ranked 1,500th, wrote that entering the secret dungeon was like sticking your head into the mouth of a beast. Remembering this, the protagonist thought that it sounded ambiguous. But all the players were of the same opinion. After all, what does this expression mean? Everyone, as one, thought that the mouth would slam shut, that same mouth that will bite and never let go, taking you to the very bottom. The secret dungeon is that very mouth, wide open, awaiting its prey. Entering inside, the protagonist imagined the very beast that was lurking in anticipation. But this didn't stop him in any way, because he wouldn't be himself if he didn't go inside. And as soon as he entered inside, a black cloud of energy immediately flew towards him. A system notification appeared that said that after receiving a direct hit, he would be affected by the status ailment, shadow vision. Under the effect of shadow vision, his field of vision is narrowed for a certain time. However, the hero characteristic was immediately activated, which blocked the mental pollution, so the effect was ignored. A smile immediately appeared on Kaiser's face. He had this ability that saved him in such situations. A creepy voice rang out, asking how he dared to enter his house without asking, deciding that the man had completely lost his fear. At that very moment, purple lights appeared, and our hero was surrounded by a huge number of monsters. After examining them, the black-haired boy realized that these were the servants of that very black goblin shaman. And above, lurking, were undead spiders, who made much more disgusting sounds than ordinary goblins. After looking at each enemy in front of him, the protagonist strained, thinking that they looked too disgusting. The voice from the man in the cloak was heard again, saying that the man was frozen with horror when he saw his children. Looking at him, the system notified that in front of him was a named boss of heroic rank, a goblin type, named Jihad Black. Kaiser was surprised, because even in secret missions, the difficulty was off the charts. But for a named boss to appear, a smile immediately appeared on his face, because when he killed the dragon, the reward was absolutely amazing, and he became interested in what would happen next. In turn, the boss continued asking. He was interested in how the man managed to find this place. He added that he didn't feel that the energy of a researcher was flowing in the person, even though many different forces were mixed in it. After hearing all this, the main character was even more surprised, because the goblin was quite perceptive. Having begun to release his power, the goblin laughed, shouting that this was an unusual specimen and that he felt sorry for him, because the guy was about to die. Immediately, all the mobs in this dungeon became active, also starting to release the same nasty energy. A smile appeared on the protagonist's face, and he asked loudly if he wasn't even tense, about to remind him. Activating his power, he added that when fighting a close-range fighter, a ranged fighter must always be on guard. Naturally, the goblin was very surprised, because he felt a human presence right behind him. The goblin immediately activated control over corpses, and thanks to his sleight of hand characteristic, his speed increased significantly, and then he launched a powerful charge of energy using the corpse's explosion. There was a powerful explosion that raised a column of dust, followed by a gust of wind, and a smile was visible on his face. However, just a moment later, that same satisfied smile was completely replaced by surprise. The goblin immediately turned towards his comrades, simultaneously glancing towards the explosion. After all, right at that moment, the goblin felt a terrifying thirst for blood from the man standing in front of him. A terrifying smile was visible on the protagonist's face. He was pleased that he had found such a wonderful place to receive the reward. The bleeding effect immediately activated. The goblin immediately looked at his body, surprised, because he did not understand when he had been wounded. The main character himself asked with a smile if he was surprised, and immediately added that he had warned him. Enraged, the goblin called the man a rat and began to gather clots of energy. Starting to send them flying in different directions, the goblin shouted that they would now see how far an ordinary person could go. Noticing the approaching attacks, the main character naturally immediately began to dodge them. But the goblin had no intention of stopping at a small amount, continuing to release more and more energy with each passing second. And then, an incredible number of rays began to fly around, hitting exactly the places where the main character stood. The boy thought to himself that he could see everything, where he was aiming, where he was going to hit, and also, looking at his face, he understood what his opponent had in mind. And then, at some point, several black goblins flew towards the black-haired boy. Goblin Black laughed. He looked pleased, shouting that death was about to come right now. The system notified that Boss Jihad Black was using the ultimate necromantic technique, Great Corpse Explosion. And at that very moment, a powerful explosion was heard. Still giggling nastily, the goblin told the guy that he himself was to blame for bringing his death closer. Suddenly, the laughter died down as a black-haired boy appeared right behind the named boss. With disgust in his voice, Kaiser asked the goblin boss if his skill was on cooldown. But without even waiting for an answer, he hit him in the face with all his strength with his fist, sending him flying. The boss was unable to regroup, so he took the blow with his face and subsequently flew straight into the wall behind him. Saliva and drops of blood flew from the dark-skinned man's mouth. His prowess was strong enough to inflict severe damage on the monster. Sliding down the rock, he grabbed his chest, starting to squeeze it, his breathing ragged. Kaiser himself slowly began to approach him. Looking towards the monster, he released a terrifying aura that seemed to consume all the air around him. Gritting his teeth in anger, the goblin called the protagonist a worthless person, promising that he would definitely take revenge on him. However, the main character wasn't going to listen to this nonsense, and he punched the boss again, causing him to spit out his blood again. But the black-haired guy wasn't going to stop even with one blow. He began to deliver blow after blow to the black-skinned man, not giving him a chance to defend himself. And then, a few minutes later, the boss's nasty voice was heard, asking the guy to stop and wait. Hearing this request, the black-haired boy was very surprised and taken aback for a second. Raising his hands, the boss said that he had hit his bone, adding in a trembling voice that you can't hit bones. Looking at the trembling body and listening to the trembling voice, the protagonist was shocked, not believing that the boss was standing in front of him. And then I remembered that this wasn't just a boss, but a heroic rank boss. Kaiser immediately remembered the great explosion of corpses, thinking that it was quite powerful, but the damage was too weak. Then, seeing that the man standing in front of him was taken aback, the boss immediately came to his senses, and just a moment later he jumped back a few meters to the side, trying to increase the distance from this strong man. Naturally, the main character came to his senses at that moment, immediately looking in the direction of the fleeing man. Immediately, dark energy began to gather around the boss, and he called the man stupid because he was waiting for him to relax. A terrifying smile immediately appeared on his face, and the system notified that the boss of the secret dungeon was activating the genetic factor. Having explained that when Jihad completed the activation of the genetic factor, his rank would increase, Kaiser was surprised by such words from the system. I started to think that even if the enemy seemed pathetic, if he moved from the rank of hero to hero plus, things would take a different turn. Grabbing his sword, he realized that raiding hero plus bosses required a full team, and he couldn't let that happen. It was with these thoughts that he jumped up and rushed towards the goblin. Along the way, increasing its strength by 20 points, the strength exceeded more than 100 points. The system immediately notified that the warrior set's effect had been activated, increasing damage to goblins by 7%. At the same second, the main character also activated the fury effect, which increased damage by 10%. The system also added that sword mastery increases damage by 10%. Looking towards the guy, the goblin couldn't believe his eyes, while Kaiser thought that everyone was equal before his sword. And at that very second he attacked the monster, it seemed his sword cut through even the air. There was a scream, then silence, as the system notified Kaiser that the secret dungeon boss had been defeated. The secret dungeon itself was successfully cleared, and a record of this was entered into the adventure book. The system also congratulated Kaiser for clearing the secret dungeon for the first time, which increased the reward, and he received a double reward for this. The shaman's robe, the shaman's orb of unquiet souls, and his level all increased, and the protagonist was delighted with the system's boosts. He immediately began to study the effects, realizing that they were a bit specific, but would definitely not be unnecessary for him. Following this, a system window opened, where it was said about the trace of a forgotten clan. It is unknown what it is and what it is used for. Lost in thought, the protagonist immediately remembered Demrock, where there were also unidentified objects. After thinking about it a little more, he decided to put it aside for the time being, as he would figure it out someday. Suddenly, he also noticed that he was given an unidentified card, which surprised him greatly. In Godot's, cards were given special attention. Not only skill sets and enchantments, but even bosses listed in the adventure book. The protagonist assumed that if it was a monster card, it was for enchantment or something similar. Opening it, he saw that it was the Black Jihad card, which had the rank of a hero, and when used, a guardian was summoned, after which the card disappeared. The guardian, as the name suggests, is a creature that protects the will of its master, the fire mage's salamander, or the alchemist's golem. These were examples of guardians. The black-haired boy was in shock as he began to remember his past. After all, if it is not a divine beast like a dragon or a tiger, which that very muscular old man was dragging around with him, assuming that in this case the guards usually only eat money and do not bring any benefit. After activating the card, the system immediately notified that the guy had summoned a guard, from which a small goblin appeared. He was level 1, and when he appeared and looked towards the main character, he immediately screamed in fear, not understanding why the black-haired man was still here. Seeing this small creature, the boy was shocked, because he thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. He thought to himself that they usually have a cool look, incredible power. But he got something incomprehensible. Falling to his knees, Jihad could not believe that he had become a dirty servant of a man. Kaiser thought to himself that his guard was a whiner. Having begun to study its characteristics, he was even more surprised, not understanding what kind of they were. The system immediately notified that Jihad Guardian Black's loyalty was low, so he could stab him in the back, asking the guy to be careful. Seeing these notification windows and then looking at the expression on his former boss's face, Kaiser thought the system was trying to make fun of him. He immediately thought that, judging by his behavior, there was no way he could let this go. And so, after thinking a little more, the black-haired boy took the first step. Frightened, the goblin immediately raised his trembling head, asking the man in a trembling voice what he wanted. The Kaiser immediately became angry, asking how he dared to call his master a man. And then, bending down to the little one, he screamed even louder, making a terrifying face. This appearance and screams scared the green-eyed creature quite a lot. After this, Kaiser began to warm up his fists, saying that for such an attitude he would receive a blow every second. The little one's face immediately became covered in sweat. He was quite frightened by these words coming from the man, but the main character wasn't joking at all. A terrifying smile appeared on his face, and it was with this smile that he said that he would now begin the educational process. A look of surprise appeared on the monster's face. He could do nothing to counter this larger man. And then, throughout the secret dungeon, screams and slaps began to be heard. The system began to notify the guards about the attack, as well as an increase in loyalty. A fairly loud scream was heard. After clearing the secret dungeon, our protagonist ended the session. As soon as he left the game, the cameras immediately opened, releasing the guy. Standing up, he stretched and began to look around because it was already evening. Leaving the room, he loudly asked his mother if there was anything to eat, but his sister replied that there was not, because she had not left anything for him. Looking towards his lying sister, the main character made a displeased face. Thinking that his eyes would never see her, he went towards the sofa and sat down next to her. He asked his sister where her mother was, to which she replied that she was at a meeting. The guy then asked what she was looking at, to which the girl replied that it was Godot's. Surprised, the guy asked again if his sister also played it, to which she replied that everyone plays this game now. The guy was very surprised by this, and the girl, in turn, added, disinterested in the dialogue, that she was level 71. Naturally, upon hearing such incredible figures, our black-haired boy was quite surprised. After a short pause, he told his sister that if she was level 71, then she had obviously been playing for a long time. She thought for a moment, saying that she had been playing for about 6 months, adding that a friend had promised to level her up, which was why she had come in but ended up getting hooked. Lost in thought, The guy couldn't believe that it would take him 6 months to reach such a level. He inadvertently said it out loud. That's why the girl sitting next to her pointed out that she wouldn't spend 10 hours on it like some people, which is why it took so long. Between two. And so, the news of the Heroes Guild began. The girl spoke loudly that she knew them. Hearing this name, the protagonist asked again, not understanding what kind of guild it was. And my sister explained that this was the most popular guild among young people. In terms of popularity, they were almost as popular as the Liquidators. Upon hearing this, Kaiser asked why, since they weren't even in the top 10. And the sister explained that it was all because they were handsome. And the head of the guild was Burze, explaining that guys might like the Liquidator, but girls are mostly fans of heroes. Seeing the appearance of the guild leader, the hero, a black-haired boy, said that he was too cute, but the sister did not agree with this. She was interested. She said that her brother should look at his face, because it was the standard of beauty. Having added that her brother was as far behind him as the moon was behind him, these words angered the guy quite a lot, and he thought to himself that she should look in the mirror herself. Standing up, the black-haired man said that he would at least go and practice, and his sister in turn added that this chapter was also popular on YouTube. Naturally, Kaiser was again surprised by such words, asking again about YouTube, and she explained that now all the guilds have their own channels, and their videos often get 100 million views. Having heard such incredible numbers, the main character was naturally shocked. The main character immediately attacked his sister with questions, because if there were 100 views, that meant they were raking in the money, and she confirmed this. The sister added that they were raking in about 1 billion won, and Kaiser immediately thought that this could buy an incredible amount of chicken. Standing up again, he repeated the word billion over and over again without stopping, which frightened his little sister. Without stopping doing this for a second, he went back to his room, and still repeating this while standing in the room, he loudly slammed his door. Seeing such a strange reaction, the girl thought that her little brother had gone crazy. Upon entering the room, he immediately fell into the game entry chamber, clearly thinking over his plan of action. Once he got into the game, he decided that he would start by recording a little at a time. At that moment, a goblin appeared, rubbing his eyes, surprised by the appearance of his master. Hearing such words from the guard, Kaiser became angry, asking if he was being too insolent. The little one immediately began to make excuses, but the black-haired man asked him to keep quiet and call him as he liked. And then he threw a cloak in his direction, telling him to put it on, explaining that he himself couldn't wear it anyway, and it wouldn't hurt for him to at least wear something. The system immediately notified that loyalty had decreased by 2 points, and the goblin himself said that since the owner had given him clothes, he was free. However, the protagonist immediately released a terrifying aura, clenching his fist and looking towards his guard. Seeing this reaction, the goblin's face broke out in sweat, and the system notified that loyalty had increased by 2 points. The Kaiser was not pleased with his guard's behavior, but decided to let it all slide. Jihad, in turn, continued to look towards his master, covered in sweat. He began to twist the cloak from side to side, examining it carefully. The protagonist repeated that he should put it on quickly, because precious time was running out. At some point, the main character threw a blade towards the black leather man. Having grabbed it, he then pulled it towards himself, starting to hold the weapon for its owner. Kaiser's face was covered with a terrifying energy. His thoughts were only about pumping, but it quickly turned to discontent. Exhaling heavily, the black-haired protagonist thought that this loyalty was just like an elastic band. While putting on his clothes, Jihad asked his master where they would go next, to which the black-haired man replied with a smile on his face, "Swing." Naturally, the black goblin did not understand this, wanting to clarify this with his master, but did not have time. And so, a fierce battle began. Screams, sounds of pain, and splashes of liquids could be heard throughout the dungeon. The system continued to notify Kaiser of victories over monsters. Looking around, Jihad thought that all these monsters were poor fellows. After all, they were unlucky enough to meet his owner. He was a real demon. Suddenly, Jihad was distracted from his thoughts by Kaiser, who called him over. The little black goblin immediately ran up to his master, who was sitting on a log. Sitting down, Kaiser told Jihad to put the knocked-out items aside and make undead from the corpses. Having thrown down his sword, Jihad immediately began to carry out his master's order. And so, approaching one corpse, he carefully examined the red goblin. Raising his hands, he began to chant a spell, gathering clots of dark energy around himself. At some point, the body of the lying goblin became covered in this dark energy. At that very second, the system notified that the guardian Jihad Black had successfully turned the red goblin into undead. And so, Jihad approached Kaiser, saying that he was done. For now, this was his limit. Lost in thought, the protagonist spoke well, because in the future it will be very useful. And so, Jihad turned to his undead and began to say something in an incomprehensible language. As soon as he finished, the red goblins immediately turned around and rushed to the side. The Kaiser was surprised by this and asked his guard where they ran and what he had told them. And the black man explained that he had ordered them to collect items for the owner. The protagonist's face immediately changed. He thought that he had harnessed them to do his dirty work. Exhaling heavily, Kaiser thought out loud that when he raised 2 more levels, he hoped to run into some elite mob. After a short pause, Jihad said that if he was talking about the elite, then he knew where they were. Naturally, the black-haired protagonist was shocked by what he had just heard. Seeing such a reaction from the owner, Jihad said that they were lazy. That's why they always sat in the same place. In an instant, Kaiser's expression changed. He couldn't believe that several people had gathered in one place. And so our heroes set out in search of those very elite monsters. Sometime later, they reached the place of residence. The elite goblins were sitting by the fire talking in their language. The main character's guard asked the owner if it was them, to which the boy happily replied that it was them. Smiling madly, he thought that this was a real find. Starting to look around at everyone, he could not believe that such a huge number had gathered here. A surprise quest has been activated. A warrior test, rewarding 1 coupon for a mid-rank skill summon, limited to 40 hours. At that moment, our main character was on fire. He was going to complete this task no matter what it took. Unable to bear it any longer, he rushed towards the gathering of elite monsters. With a terrifying smile, he shouted as he greeted the elite goblins. Naturally, upon seeing our hero, they immediately reacted to him, grabbing their weapons and going into battle. Although the attack was fast, Kaiser was able to easily dodge it by jumping to the side. Having dodged, he immediately jumped up, preparing to counterattack his opponent. The enemy himself, in turn, was surprised by such a reaction from a person, but he didn't expect that he would immediately go on the attack after dodging. So he immediately missed the attack. As soon as the guy jumped back again, the red elite goblin's mangled face, covered in blood, appeared. He immediately fell to the ground, and the rest of the elite monsters immediately went on the offensive, rushing to attack. Naturally, Kaiser was not going to stop at just one monster. Summoning his dagger, he rushed to meet his opponents. As he approached, he used the skill Vital Point Strike, dealing several attacks at once. At the same time, the bleeding effect was activated, which finished off the cuts. And then, literally a moment later, they began to fall, one after another, covered in their own blood. Another elite monster rushed at the black-haired boy, intending to avenge his comrades. The Kaiser was about to take the blow, so he took a healthy sword from the red-skinned man. Although the goblin thought that this would not save the man, he realized within a second that his most powerful attack had been stopped. Naturally, he was quite surprised by this, making a sound corresponding to this roar. But almost immediately, he was thrown back by a powerful kick from Kaiser, the blow causing the huge body to fly to the side. Not expecting this, he began to spit blood, unable to contain the onslaught of the black-haired man. Following this attack, Kaiser grabbed his huge sword and began to pull it out from behind his back. He jumped up and swung his sword, intending to deal a critical hit to the elite monster. Looking towards the man, the red-skinned one was about to fight back, starting to growl loudly. But our main character wasn't going to let his opponent get the better of him. And at that moment, his eyes began to glow with a scarlet light. And just a moment later, the body of that very goblin, who was confident in his own strength, was cut in half. Kaiser's face became covered in blood, which began to fly in all directions. The monster's evil face was replaced by horror. And then there was silence all around. Only the thick smell of blood hung in the air. Observing this, the protagonist's guard considered everything that was happening at that moment to be pure madness. Clenching his mouth, Black thought about what he had felt back in the western forest, realizing that the person standing before him was clearly not a human. Looking at his master, he considered him a real devil. After exhaling a little, the black-haired boy stuck his blade into the ground. Having said that he was almost finished with the warriors, so he should appear soon, a system window suddenly appeared. Having been informed that he had met the boss of a hidden location, the quest evolved into a chain of trials of a great warrior. And so, our main character saw the great goblin warrior Karuk. He was the great named boss of the hidden location. Looking at him, Kaiser had a terrifying smile on his face. He thought that in front of him was not a boss, but a bag of gifts. Gripping his huge blade more tightly, he immediately rushed to meet the boss. The protagonist was going to deal with him as quickly as possible in order to receive his precious reward. And so, two fairly strong auras almost locked in battle, their energy cutting through the air. Jihad immediately shouted at the master not to do this, because with his current level, He couldn't even count on winning. Seeing the boss swing, he shouted to Kaiser that his sword would simply break at the moment of impact. The system immediately notified our boy that the boss was using the merciless strike skill. And so, the blue-skinned one, with a rather animalistic cry, swung his axe even harder, and then he hit it with incredible speed. But it hit the ground, and the black-haired boy simply disappeared from the attack zone. Naturally, it was the boss who was quite surprised by this, not understanding what was happening. Jihad thought the same thing, but he managed to notice what his master had just done. The protagonist deliberately angled his blade to parry the attack and transfer the full force of the attack into the ground. Kaiser raised his head and a smile appeared on his face. He was pleased with himself because everything had turned out exactly as he wanted it to. The same could not be said about the boss himself. The surprise on his face turned to displeasure, and then, with anger and angrily screaming, he raised his axe again above his head, preparing to attack again. But our main character wasn't going to just stand there and watch as he was attacked. He again brought his sword straight towards the attack, but also using the radius. And so, an endless exchange of attacks began between these two. Jihad Black watched what was happening and could not understand what he was seeing right now. Seeing how the attacks intersected, making quite a loud sound, but none of them reached their target. Taking a closer look, he saw the expression on the black-haired man's face and assumed that he was indeed using parry. Parrying is a reflection of an enemy's attack. If the timing is incorrect, it might not work. The only defensive skill a swordsman can have that is considered a skill beyond the ordinary when the conditions are met is a cheat move. Capable of neutralizing even legendary skills, however, due to the extremely low chance of success, almost no one used it. While using the parry skill, Kaiser thought to himself that he never thought that this skill would drop from a low-rank summon. The system also continued to notify the black-haired boy about the use of skills from the boss. At what point was there a powerful explosion that completely obscured all visibility? Taking advantage of this, Kaiser appeared from behind Karuk, preparing to deliver a powerful attack to his back. Turning around, the blue-skinned man noticed the main character, because he felt him, surprised by his presence behind him. The main character himself, with a rather terrifying grimace, asked the boss if he was currently experiencing a skill cooldown. Karuk began to shout angrily towards his human opponent, not intending to lose to him. Jihad, looking at what was happening, was more and more amazed by his master's skills. The protagonist struck. The boss's blood flew in all directions, and the system congratulated Kaiser on his victory over the hidden location's boss. The achievement was recorded in the adventure book, and at the same time, our boy completed the Great Warrior's test, receiving his reward. The reward consisted of 200 gold, experience, 2 mid-rank summon coupons, and a set of Karuk's leather armor. Naturally, our boy couldn't get enough of such an incredible number of useful awards. Seeing such a reaction, Jihad Black thought that the man was at it again. After all, in battle he looks like a real demon. But as soon as he starts opening cards or something like that, then he becomes insane. The main character's expression spoke for itself. The protagonist immediately began using the coupon to summon a mid-rank skill. Immediately, our main character was surrounded by a huge number of skill cards, and then the first skill dropped. It was the Rising Dragon Strike. The strike deals powerful damage on impact. The second was Striking, a rare class. When used on a target, increases physical attack by 40 units for 40 seconds. A key skill for support classes. It has a duration of 40 seconds and a cooldown of 40 seconds. Essentially increasing attack power infinitely. This skill converts damage from a normal sword into damage from a two-handed sword. Clutching his head, the protagonist thought that it was simply unbelievably cool. A DD who buffs himself and fights. And even the Rising Dragon Strike. It looks cool. Kaiser always wanted to try it. He couldn't enjoy the ideal conditions. Suddenly, the system distracted the protagonist from his inner admiration by notifying him of an unidentified object. The guy got a set of Karuk leather armor. Each item had a rank from Rare Plus to Heroic. Naturally, our guy was happy with the new set. The goblin's old attire immediately disappeared, and new equipment appeared in its place. The system announced that he was wearing the Great Warrior's set. Looking at himself, Kaiser thought that this multicolored light looked much cooler than the previous one. Jihad said that the owner looked good, and then he turned to Kaiser again, saying that he sometimes scared him quite a lot. Turning around with a smile on his face, the black-haired boy happily asked if he was imagining it too. Raising his head with pride, he said that sometimes he was afraid of himself. He couldn't wait to see how far he could climb. Looking at his master, Jihad Black tried to understand what kind of person stood before him, but he almost immediately dismissed these thoughts, deciding that the person in front of him was an ordinary psycho. The system immediately announced to the protagonist that his guard's loyalty had decreased by 1 point. The protagonist asked the goblin if he had mentally cursed him. But the goblin immediately said that this was not the case. Immediately, a thirst for blood appeared. Taking out his sword, Kaiser said in a harsh voice that if he started showing off, he would kill him. Jihad Black's face immediately became covered in sweat, and he began waving his arms, saying that he understood his master. The system immediately announced to the guy that the goblin's loyalty had again increased by 1 point, at which point the black-haired man exhaled heavily. He sheathed his sword and began to walk away, telling his guard that it was time for them to leave. Following his master, Jihad asked where they were going this time, to which the main character, without even thinking, replied that they needed to kill the boss right now. Lowering his head, the boy's guard began to deliberately say that since the master had killed the great warrior, he would do the same to the others. However, before he could finish his thought, he suddenly fell silent, because he realized that at that very moment, a notification window popped up in front of Kaiser's face. The system said that in order to get to the next city, he must pass the continent's test. The hunt for the field boss began. The Western Forest is the spawn zone of the Spider Queen Eliza, which was the name of the next boss Kaiser had to deal with. Deep in the forest, there was a crowd of people discussing the boss's appearance among themselves. It seemed like they were waiting forever, and they still had to wait 10 minutes. Everyone wanted to know where she would emerge this time, because last time she appeared in the eastern nest. Some of them, based on previous information, assumed that it would appear in the west or north. Our main character entered this crowd along with his guard. Turning to the kid, Kaiser decided to ask him, just in case, if he knew where the boss would appear, to which Jihad replied, "No, because she was from the next generation after him, so he was not aware." At that very moment, Kaiser exhaled heavily, because he thought that he knew every bush in this forest. Jihad Black himself looked quite puzzled as he looked around. Our main character was the same, trying to figure out where this boss would appear, deciding that wherever she was, if he used the rear approach, he would be able to get there quickly. Suddenly, the system announced that the Slayer characteristic had been activated, and the location of the field boss, the Spider Queen Eliza, had been discovered. And right in front of him, the black-haired boy saw the transparent red silhouette of a spider. Looking at it, he tried to understand what it was, because they wouldn't receive the title of Spider-type Slayer. Suddenly, his face changed dramatically. He couldn't believe it, because there was only one answer. The effect of the action applies not only to the bosses he killed, but to all bosses in the game. But almost immediately, I threw these thoughts aside, because there was no difference. Now, something completely different was important. Immediately, that terrifying smile appeared on his face. He thought that he could kill the boss solo. The rear approach was activated. In an instant, the main character disappeared from the place where he stood, and the players standing nearby did not even understand what had happened. At this time, a huge spider was crawling in the dark cave, uttering the same word, Eliza. Right behind her, Kaiser appeared with his guard Jihad, the system immediately notifying that he had met the Spider Queen Eliza. With a smile on his face, the protagonist was surprised that the skill actually worked. Jihad himself did not understand how the owner did this, and decided to clarify, but the main character replied that it would take too long to explain. With that same terrifying expression on his face, he told the guard to just consider themselves extremely lucky in this situation. Looking forward, he said that in front of them stood a real giant. The system announced the beginning of the battle with the boss. The spider, uttering that very word Eliza, rushed towards the protagonist, clearly intending to kill him. But the protagonist was not going to let such a perfect opportunity slip away so easily and immediately prepared for battle. In an instant, he reacted to the attack, which was quite fast for his size, by jumping to the side. Immediately, the boy's entire body was covered in energy. With a smile on his face, he used the skill of going behind the enemy. The field boss looked ahead and saw how the enemy who had just stood in front of her simply disappeared. Feeling an incredible energy behind her, she began to turn, trying to react. But as soon as she turned around, she saw a huge golden dragon approaching her at incredible speed. It was our main character who used the skill Rising Dragon Strike. The set effect deals a 6% additional damage to the enemy. The protagonist carefully examined the boss again. His body was covered in a yellow aura. He was going to deal with the boss as soon as possible. With incredible force, he pushed off the ground, rushing towards the boss. Having drawn his blade, the protagonist began to gather energy in order to deliver a powerful attack on his opponent. Eliza herself, in turn, tensed up, seeing such incredible speed, but she couldn't do anything to counter the speed. The black-haired boy delivered several accurate blows. Having flown past the huge boss, Kaiser stopped, even sliding slightly along the ground. But even there, he was not going to stop, rushing towards the spider again, but this time from behind. His eyes glowed yellow as he used his striking skill. and the system notified him of an increase in attack power. Releasing incredible energy, he rushed at full speed straight towards the boss. Eliza's body began to tremble. She was scared, because in this fight she was clearly losing to our main character. Appearing in front of the boss, the main character used the Rising Dragon Strike skill, and a golden dragon immediately appeared in front of the boss. An incredible force struck the boss's skull, and such a loud roar was heard that it seemed as if an earthquake had started. A green liquid burst from the boss's mouth and rushed upwards, accompanied by a painful sound. And then the boss broke through the ground under his own weight, crushing the floor, and a dense stream of wind arose. Watching what was happening, the protagonist's guard did not envy this spider, considering him a poor man, since he had fallen into the hands of such a demon. And now, just a moment later, the main character stood at the head of the lying spider. Opening her eyes, Boss Spider Eliza saw a not very beautiful picture in front of her, and her face immediately changed to fear. The protagonist standing in front of her gave off a terrifying aura as he said that he had no idea who this Eliza was. And then he raised his fist, clenched his fist, and asked if she would call her when she died. Immediately the spider began to repeat Lisa, Elisa over and over again. The main character made the boss tremble with fear, and just a second later, the rather unpleasant sounds of beatings began to be heard throughout the dungeon. Watching this, the protagonist's guard thought that this was too cruel. After all, right before his eyes, the black-haired man dealt blow after blow to the huge spider, not giving it even a second to catch its breath. Suddenly, Guardian Black became thoughtful, starting to repeat the name Lisa in his head, because he had already heard it somewhere. But a moment later, his face changed. He immediately shouted to his master to stop, and naturally, the main character immediately looked towards his guard. The goblin jumped, shouting for his master to stop, repeating this phrase over and over again. The main character didn't understand what had happened, as this goblin rushed right past him at incredible speed, surprising the boy. With tears in his eyes, Black stroked his boss's head, asking her to open her eyes, screaming that it was him. Barely opening his eyes, the huge spider looked at the small black goblin who was calling her. Realizing that she did not recognize him, the goblin took off his cloak, again asking with tears in his eyes to look at him. At that very moment, the boss's eyes filled with tears. Her tone changed. She was glad to see Black. And so, we are transported back 150 years. He was walking through the forest. Suddenly, he heard some strange sounds that reminded him of words. Looking down, he saw a spider who kept saying Lisa. Naturally, the goblin was surprised by this. Taking it in his arms, he began to examine it from all sides, wondering if such things really existed. After thinking for a bit, the goblin asked the spider happily if she would go with him, to which the spider began to nod its head in the affirmative. The future dungeon boss was delighted with the offer, making joyful sounds. And so, sometime later, the two monsters had already reached the goblin's dwelling. Sitting at the table, Black was scrolling through the word that the spider was saying. He happily remarked that Lisa sounded a bit too simple, suggesting the name Eliza. Hearing such a proposal, the spider could not contain his joy and began to jump, shouting, Lisa! Still with the same smile, the goblin asked not to say Lisa, but to pronounce Eliza. But she insisted on her own. Exhaling, the goblin said that she could do whatever she wanted, but he was still going to call her Eliza. Getting up from the table, he headed towards the door. Taking his cloak, he said that today he would have to go on business alone. The little spider said Lisa again, but the goblin realized that she was asking to go with him. Putting on his cloak, Black said that she couldn't go there, because everything there was too dangerous for her. Opening the door, he said that he would be back soon, closing it with a smile on his face. And so, the future boss of the dungeon began to wait for his new friend. However, after that very departure, the Black Goblin never returned. Day gave way to night. The moon gave way to the sun. But he was still not there. And no matter how much the moon rose and the sun set, the man did not return. Thus, 100 years passed. All this time, Eliza faithfully waited for her master. When from the long wait, even the hut began to fall into disrepair, Eliza finally decided to go to the western forest, where she first met her master, repeating to herself, so as not to forget, the name that her master gave her. And so these two, hugging each other, sobbed, not even trying to calm down. After some thought, Kaiser now realized that his guard was the same one who abandoned Eliza. Naturally, the Black Goblin was a little shocked by this assumption. However, he again pressed himself into the spider's body, continuing to sob loudly, just like the boss. The main character, in turn, did not understand why he had been hiding all this time, because not a year, not two, but a whole 150 years had passed. Lowering his gaze, The Kaiser's guard replied that he could not tell his master this, since it was not in his power at the moment. Lost in thought, the protagonist did not understand what his ward meant right now, clearly frowning. However, the Black Goblin, lowering his gaze, apologized. It was hard for him to ignore his master. Seeing such a reaction, the frowning face disappeared. The boy was surprised by the guard's appearance, and then, looking away, he asked what he should do with this now. Because this is a graduation quest, so he can't help but kill her. After some thought, Guardian Black agreed with his master's words. Suddenly, Eliza began to say something in her own language to the monster standing next to her. The little goblin's whole body twitched. He couldn't understand what she was talking about right now. Suddenly, she shouted that no, she couldn't. But the spider stood her ground. Seeing the two arguing, the protagonist intervened, asking them what had happened. Releasing a terrifying aura, the goblin turned to his master, saying that the spider was about to explode. The main character, having heard this, was surprised by what he heard, and even unconsciously asked again. But no one answered him. Eliza continued to insist on her own, while the little guard tried to dissuade her from this action. Suddenly, with a sharp movement, she brought her paw to her jaw, biting herself hard, and blood began to splatter in all directions. Black shouted the monster's name in alarm, while the protagonist looked at the boss in surprise, not understanding what was happening. The system notified the guy that Boss Eliza was struck by a strong poison, and her hit points had dropped below 10%. Seeing how Eliza was gradually losing consciousness, the protagonist's guard tried to understand what she was doing. She answered him something. The goblin's face gradually became sadder. It was hard for him to accept such actions from the spider. Eliza could barely speak the words she said as she finished speaking to her old friend. Walking away, with sadness in his voice, Black turned towards the owner, telling him to hit faster. Kaiser did not understand this, asking again. However, the guard stood his ground, starting to shout for him to quickly pierce her with his sword, because there was no time left. With a heavy feeling in his chest, the black-haired boy asked his guard if he was sure about this. But the goblin stood his ground, shouting for the protagonist to strike as quickly as possible, adding that everything would be fine. After hesitating for another second, Kaiser listened to his companion and began to draw his sword. Lifting it into the air, he asked if they were sure he should hit it, and the spider nodded in the affirmative. And so, the main character struck. Blood splattered in all directions, and the system notified that the boss had been killed. She also added that thanks to the absorption effect, all characteristics were increased by 6 points, and a note was made in the adventure book. Looking at the lying spider, which was not moving at all, Kaiser asked his guard if they had really done the right thing with him, to which the little goblin standing nearby said in a trembling voice, "Yes," when suddenly a sound was heard from the lying spider. When Kaiser suddenly noticed a small spider, the system notified that he had discovered a hidden named boss, Eliza, who was parasitizing the Spider Queen, Eliza. Eliza's loyalty and closeness to the guardian named Jihad reached its peak, and the system asked Kaiser if he gave her the go-ahead to join Jihad's command. The protagonist immediately thought, surprised that she was a parasite. During Demrock's time, there were also such bosses, a special type of boss. They usually couldn't be killed in one go. They constantly changed their hosts, which was quite annoying for players. But the main character was shocked that such a creature would come to him on its own, because he had just acquired another guardian. Seeing the system window, he thought again, thinking that this was quite good. However, if you think about it, Jihad turned out to be quite useful, thought our black-haired boy. Looking at him, he also thought that he was collecting objects, obeying unquestioningly, and finding hidden locations. Kaiser's face turned red. He believed that last time he had come across not a guard, but a real treasure. Suddenly, Jihad Black began to sweat as he felt an overwhelming aura behind him. Looking back, he saw his master, deciding, realizing that something bad was about to happen. Suddenly, the spider jumped out of the hands of the black-skinned goblin, surprising him. In 2 leaps, she jumped onto our protagonist's shoulder, surprising him. Having started to tell the main character something in his language, naturally the boy did not understand her language. However, Jihad intervened here and told the owner that she thanked him. After a short pause, the former dungeon boss continued to tell our main character something. Here, the boy's first guard intervened again, saying that the spider was asking to follow her, thus thanking him. The protagonist was surprised, because he didn't understand what kind of gratitude he would now receive. But the spider insisted on his own, and so the 2 guys followed the little spider, going, as it seemed, deeper and deeper into the dungeon. Sometime later, she jumped on our boy again, starting to speak in her own language, telling him something. The goblin translated, joyfully telling his master that Eliza said they had already arrived. Realizing that she meant there was some kind of entrance or exit ahead, Kaiser went inside. Upon entering this so-called entrance, the system immediately notified the guy that he had discovered a hidden location. And so, the main character saw a huge number of spiders in front of him. The system explained that this was an incubator for the eggs of the Spider Queen. And just a moment later, the blue notification window turned red, indicating that these were the offspring of the Spider Queen, field bosses. And at this very moment, the main character remembered that the essence of the graduation quest was to kill the field boss. And this meant more than just Eliza herself. Even though all of this is designed to defeat Eliza, she is the only target. So the outcome will depend on whether or not Eliza can be defeated. Looking around, the main character thought that if he could defeat them, then... However, before he finished this thought, a smile appeared on his face. As he drew his sword and released a terrifying aura, he thought that he would definitely test his judgment right now. Without waiting a second, he immediately rushed towards the gathering of spiders at incredible speed. In turn, the field bosses were not going to wait for the man to attack first. They also pounced on him. The protagonist, as usual, plunged headlong into the battle. His eyes began to sparkle with a scarlet light. As soon as he reached the center of the field boss's gathering, a powerful explosion was heard, raising a bright red column of dust. As soon as the donkey settled down, a black-haired boy appeared, cutting down spiders left and right. Blood flew in all directions. The stone walls, floor, and ceiling began to be covered with green light. Eliza said something anxiously to the goblin, who said with heaviness in his voice that she was right. After a short pause, the goblin added that she was definitely right. Their master was damn strong. And so, gradually the sounds of battle died down, and one after another the spiders began to fall to the ground. As soon as Kaiser landed, the system notified him that the first test had been successfully completed. In total, he killed the hidden field boss as well as 34 regular field bosses, and the system congratulated Kaiser. She also added that with a score of 1,500 points, he received an S rank. He was the first to receive it in the first test, taking first place in the ranking. The system immediately started showering titles. First S rank, best graduate. All stats were increased by 5 points. Suddenly, the spider jumped on our main character again, distracting him from his own jubilation. The protagonist thanked Eliza, saying that her gratitude exceeded all his expectations. But she shouted at the owner in disapproval. And Jihad explained that Eliza said she hadn't even begun to thank him yet. Naturally, the black-haired boy was very surprised by this, turning towards the spider who was telling him something. Looking towards Jihad, he understood everything, pointing his finger up, adding that the spider says that the reward is there. Turning towards the hill, Kaiser immediately used the Eye of Truth to get a better look at what they meant. As he peered closer, he noticed a bright scarlet light, the system notifying him that he had discovered a fragment of fate. As soon as the system notified about this, the main character's face immediately changed. A huge crowd of people gathered near the cave, who came to the conclusion that the spider was hidden here, since this was its last spawning place. One of the men shouted for no one to be nervous, to act strictly according to the plan. Quickly kill Eliza and meet in Brion. The crowd immediately exploded at this speech. Each of these players was determined to win. However, their joy did not last long, as the system notified that the Spider Queen Eliza had been defeated, and the continent's test was complete. They didn't understand who could have killed her if she hadn't appeared yet, deciding that some guild had entered before them. Suddenly, one of the men shouted for everyone to look, because the real-time rating had just been updated. With a trembling voice, the boy said that the top player's recent achievements included killing the Spider Queen Eliza. Everyone immediately started shouting for the guy to look at the nickname quickly, deciding that it was some kind of cheater. The guy answered the crowd that the nickname was Kaiser. At this time, the main character had already reached the redstone itself and took it in his hands. He said out loud that with the help of this fragment, he would receive the class quest, Legacy of Destiny. Black congratulated the owner, shouting that now he was no longer unemployed, he would become a real adventurer. However, the main character was in no hurry to rejoice. Having fallen to the ground, he became lost in thought, completely immersed in himself. The black-skinned goblin didn't understand why his master was so sour, so he asked him about it. After thinking, Kaiser said that he had some kind of bad feeling. But Black did not understand because the owner received such an incredible reward. The reward for the quest was the relic of Kaziar. Kaiser was in shock. The guard shouted that it was a relic, and that he would finally have one like the other top players. But the main character shouted back at the guard. After all, the risk of failure was high. The quest would disappear, and the class would be cancelled. It would simply become an NPC with a high degree of freedom. Clutching his head, he screamed that if this happened, he would lose everything he had achieved up to this point. As his face suddenly became even worse, He told them to wait. Turning towards the goblin, he asked him what would happen to him if he became unemployed. Jihad did not appreciate this and yelled at his master. Because he doubted his loyalty, Eliza also yelled at Kaiser. The goblin asked if he was only egging him on because he was looking forward to betraying him and running away as soon as he lost his class. Having struck Jihad, Kaiser stood up, thanking him for his honesty, intending to take on this quest to spite him. The system immediately notified him, describing the quest. He needed to pass a test and prove that he was worthy of inheriting Cassiar's will. With a smile on his face, the protagonist thought that if he could defeat the Iron-Blood Dragon, he could handle this too. Having decided that it was time to begin, the guy agreed to the quest, thinking that no matter what mob appeared, he was going to wipe it out. It happened when he drew the Cassiara card as a hidden element. The man screamed in surprise, not believing that the Apostle of Cassiar himself was standing in front of him. The main character, bowing, said that everything was correct. He was the Apostle of Cassiar, adding that if he gives him his blessing. However, before he could finish speaking, he caught the water. The man opposite him poured and splashed the water on the boy. Naturally, the main character got angry. Asking what he was doing, the man explained that he was the pathetic Apostle of Cassiara, and that he dared to appear in this holy place in such an unclean state. And then he left, closing the door behind him. Kaiser continued to shout for him to give him the reward, but there was no talk of any reward. Turning around, Kaiser began to leave, deciding that Cassiar had robbed them all. It was all strange, because it was worth mentioning Cassiar's name. As the priests began to have fits, our black-haired boy did not understand what was happening, so he decided to take another close look at the description of his class. Cassiar was the god of war, the lord of the Abtartel, whom even the gods feared, the only true god, a former adventurer. Now Kaiser understood that if even the gods feared him, then to the priests he must look like Satan himself. A smile appeared on the guy's face after realizing this, because it was quite unusual. When accepting the quest, the protagonist thought that a bunch of elite monsters would simply fall on him. But somewhere, he was clearly mistaken. The loud sound even scared Kaiser, who screamed in the direction of the noise. Weapons started falling around Jihad. He didn't understand what was happening and why weapons were falling straight from the sky. Suddenly, he pointed his finger, shouting to the owner to look straight ahead, because something was clearly about to start. The system announced that the god of war, Cassiar, was awakening from the seal, and Kaiser had to hold out for 5 minutes. Naturally, the protagonist didn't immediately believe the system window until he reread the notification, greatly surprised by this turn of events, thinking that it was not an elite or mythical might, but the god himself who decided to appear. He was also tense that he needed to survive for 5 minutes. Immediately, energy began to gather in his hand. He decided that rereading would not change anything, so he needed to act. A sword appeared in his hands, and with a smile on his face, he said that he just needed to survive for about 5 minutes. His face changed completely. Kaiser shouted that this task was as easy as pie. He immediately looked at his opponent, seeing a truly terrifying look. A strange feeling ran through the protagonist's entire body, and beads of sweat appeared on his face. Looking at the body, he did not understand what it was, deciding that it was intimidation, because his body refused to move. He thought about the feeling, like his whole body was bound in chains. At this time, Cassiar was approaching him. Black was shouting at the owner to get ready for a fight, as was Eliza. Turning around, the boy's guards did not understand what was happening to their master, worried, asking why he was silent. The boy himself was straining with all his might at this time, not understanding how this had happened. Looking at his opponent, Kaiser didn't understand why the heroic characteristic refused to work right now. The system responded that the characteristic was deactivated. It is not a status effect. The protagonist couldn't believe that without any skills or debuffs, the enemy radiated such monstrous intimidation. Having grabbed Eliza, Jihad rushed to flee, shouting that the master was already baked. Naturally, Kaiser was angry about this. He couldn't believe that he had chickened out and frozen in front of some pile of data. Raising his head, he screamed at the top of his lungs for the game to stop making him laugh, every muscle in his body tensing. Jihad, hearing this cry, stopped, looking towards the owner. Even the boss who appeared was surprised by this. This time, our protagonist's face changed, and he waved his sword and pointed towards the black-haired opponent. Smiling, he said that he had told so much crap in this life, so he didn't even think about being scared. Approaching, Jihad pointed to the owner's legs, saying that for someone so fearless, his legs were shaking too much. Kaiser turned to the guard and yelled at him to shut up, as he was just trying to look cool. Jihad smiled and wished his master luck, and then, turning again to the god of war, Kaiser said that the skills he received from him were very useful to him, adding with a condemning cry that the penalty for failing this quest was too absurd. Our hero began waving his sword in displeasure and continued shouting that taking away everything because of one failure was complete nonsense. Kaiser showed no sign of stopping his dissatisfied shouts as the god of war looked at him with a puzzled expression. And then Kaiser started crying, asking the long-haired man if he knew how hard it was for him to get these things from him. Jihad turned to Eliza, saying that their master had completely gone crazy. The short-haired man continued, sobbing, to say that he had only just received normal skills and clothes, thinking that he would heal. But here Jihad interrupted him, yelling at the owner because he was talking to himself. By raising one finger, Kaiser indicated to the goblin that he only had 1 minute left to hold out. Realizing this, the goblin immediately gave a thumbs up, because he thought that his master had gone crazy, but he had thought up a cunning plan. The goblin once again supported his master, because if everything continued like this, they would survive and be able to leave here victorious. Suddenly, Kaiser jumped up, throwing his blade behind his back. Jihad screamed, not understanding what his master was doing. The boy thought to himself that he needed to wait until he let his guard down, and then use the rear flank approach. Gritting his teeth, he thought that if he could defeat him, he could get a hidden reward. So, as soon as he jumped, he waited until the very last moment to use the rear approach. At that moment, a smile appeared on the face of the god of war, Cassiar. Turning sharply, he grabbed our protagonist by the neck and began to squeeze it. Our hero didn't understand why the skill didn't work. It was hard for him to accept it. However, it was too late to understand anything because our hero was slammed into the ground, and it seemed that the entire dungeon would collapse from this blow. The boy's guard couldn't believe his eyes, and he screamed anxiously, calling for his master. Eliza also screamed anxiously. As soon as the dust settled, Kaiser's face was revealed to be covered in blood and he was unconscious. Guardian Jihad did not understand what to do. He was so shocked that he could not even move, continuing to anxiously call out to his master, who lay motionless on the ground. The boy himself thought to himself that he always had damn bad luck, not believing that he would now lose everything that he had achieved with such difficulty. At that moment, a sinister grin appeared on the god of war's face. He raised his other hand into the air, and Kaiser realized that he was preparing to deliver a powerful blow. It was hard for him to accept the fact of defeat, but there was nothing else left. So he closed his eyes, clenching his teeth, but he felt his collar being touched. And when he opened it, he saw Cassiar straightening his clothes, and then he moved on to his face, starting to pull at his cheeks and ears. The main character screamed about being ticklish, laughing loudly, while the god of war was sitting on him and tickling him. At some point, the long-haired man stopped doing this, looking at the guy's face, pouring it on his lips. The Kaiser immediately raised his hand, shouting what he was up to and why he stuck out his tongue while thinking something dirty. Jihad, in turn, joyfully shouted to the master that the god of war had recognized them. The protagonist did not understand this, and the guard explained that for Cassiar, sticking out his tongue meant acknowledging his enemy. Looking back at the man sitting on him, he saw a smile. Not believing it, the long-haired man made some strange sounds and shook his head several times. Jihad immediately translated, saying that God was asking if he was the one who would inherit his will. The black-haired boy immediately jumped up and started shouting that all this was true. Starting to move incomprehensibly, Jihad translated that God was saying he was the first person who did not chicken out and challenged him. He was worried, but it seemed like the will had pressed in just right, because he wanted to kill him as unworthy. But in the end, he decided that such a level would do. Kaiser didn't understand how Jihad understood him. The system notified the end of 5 minutes. Instead of the apostle path, Kaiser entered the air path. Jihad also added that Cassiar says he will give him his relic. Immediately after the goblin translated this, the god of war put his hand down his pants. Naturally, the main character was very surprised by this course of action. While the god was rummaging around in his pants, Kaiser shouted at him to wait. There was no need to rush. However, just a moment later, the guy's scream died down as some brightly shining object appeared. And again, starting to wave his arms, Kaiser shouted that he didn't need anything, asking if he knew that this wasn't that kind of game. But God was not going to stop, continuing to take out this incomprehensible thing. The main character couldn't bear it any longer and shouted, saying that he was a fucking psycho. This surprised the god of war quite a lot, because as soon as the light disappeared, some strange thing appeared. Black anxiously asked the owner what he had just thought of, and Kaiser did not understand why the object had appeared from there. Taking the relic in his hand, the system notified the guy that he had received the relic of the god of war, 1,000 changes. Kaiser was not particularly happy with the reward. While the god was waving his hand, the main character did not understand why he received a cool reward, and his soul felt so lousy. Jihad translated, saying that God says the time is up, asking those to get out as quickly as possible. Immediately, a bright light appeared beneath our heroes, reminiscent of some kind of magic circle. And just a second later, with incomprehensible screams, our heroes began to fall into it. Jihad, falling, screamed at his master to save him and Eliza, while Kaiser himself did not understand what was happening. At this time, there was a real deathly silence around the stone structure. It was until the very appearance of our heroes, who emerged from the magic circle with a loud cry. Having fallen, the Kaiser's guards could not get up, saying that they were going to vomit. The system explained that they had arrived in the second city of the main continent, the City of Promises, Brian. Kaiser was glad that they hadn't been thrown into some wilderness. Suddenly, he heard some sound. It was words. He immediately paid attention to it. Turning around, he saw an old man who was saying that although this was before the day of prophecy, fate was still contained in this. The protagonist's guard immediately warned the boy to be careful, as this old man emanated a terrifying aura. The Kaiser immediately jumped up, drew his sword, and prepared for battle. As soon as the gray-haired old man saw the blade, he immediately fell to the ground and bowed, having said that he was waiting for them, the heir who accepted the will of that very one. Introducing himself as Gamillion Adrian, who had served the royal family since the beginning of time, he waited for this moment. Jihad immediately shouted that he knew he was not simple. Kaiser was angry at the guard because he thought something completely different. The system announced the start of a class quest. Kaiser needed to hear about the erased history of humanity. If successful, a section of the main story would open. 1 billion users have been playing Godos for a year and a half since the open beta test. Even the Adventure King Barian, who has completed almost all the existing quests. After a year of fruitless searching, I declared that there is no main plot in this game. I think our main character, he couldn't believe that the story would appear here, and Adrian said that since he was here, it meant he had already met Mr. Cassiar. The old man asked to be allowed to tell him a story that the heir was obliged to know, and after thinking a little, the Kaiser gave his consent. And so, the story began in the year 1405. Humanity was completely different, possessing great potential in all areas. Their power was so great that they occupied one of the 5 great thrones of the world. And just when they had established themselves as the masters of the throne, they invaded, the despicable creatures who now rule the aliens as if they were their servants, those who are now called gods. Jihad was surprised, still screaming in surprise. Could it really be that the gods were really enemies? But Kaiser shut him up, asking him to be quiet and let him concentrate. The gods, fleeing after Ragnarok, the great war in which all the divine worlds perished, desired to capture Abrattle, and a long battle began to defend their home. In that war, 1/3 of all of Abtartel was destroyed. But the tide of the brutal battle turned. Only one man, the god of war Cassiar, entered into battle against the enemies. He crushed 4 gods of mythical rank, and they believed that victory was near until it burst out of the ground. Another race, born from the accumulated anger of fallen gods and peoples, impenetrable darkness, an abyss. Both gods and humans began to succumb to the influence of the abyss, returning in the form of monsters. It was like a living hell. The whole world was in danger of being swallowed up. When the danger became common, the warring gods and people imprisoned a tormented nurse to avoid death. In other words, the condition was to give all the people to the rulers as an offering. As a result, the great humanity, having lost its potential, became only weak slaves under the power of the gods. And Lord Cassiar was immediately sealed. And the gods began to use even them, the aliens. As soon as they get into their world, they plunge them into the abyss, destroying their true essence. Turning the puppets into his apostles, the Kaiser was naturally very surprised by this, wanting to say, however, the guard interrupted him, telling the owner to be silent and let him concentrate. Having hit the guard on the head for his insolence, Kaiser now understood how it all started. At this time, Jihad, looking towards Kaiser, thought that he was annoying him too much. The protagonist thought to himself that this is how things turned out after he couldn't choose a shooting range. Kaiser remained in the status of an adventurer, and not the apostle. Having defeated the dragon, he received the Eye of Truth, and this ultimately led to the inevitable meeting with Cassiar. He believed that this was fate. Thinking about the difference between him and the ordinary players who started with the potential of apostles, there was a difference from the very start. The old man interrupted the boy's thoughts, saying that they had waited for almost 1,000 years, enduring until this moment when the prophesied heir would appear. Looking at his hand, the protagonist couldn't understand what this feeling of euphoria was in his chest right now. After all, they were waiting for him. He was the only player with the main quest. He believed that this path was laid out especially for him. Covering his face, he thought he was making history again by saying that being so cool was also a problem. The system began to notify the protagonist, having finished, that the main plot had been activated, and a section of the main quest had been created. The old man explained that now the boy must collect the fragments of fate. There are 10 of them in total. The boy already had one. The boy was surprised to himself, wondering if this was really the same one he had received from Eliza. The old man explained that after those bitter negotiations, Mr. Cassiar was instantly sealed, losing the ability to appear in this world. Just before his imprisonment, he took the last risk for the sake of humanity. Gathering all his strength, he extracted what was fundamental. However, due to the power of the seal, the artifact was scattered in pieces across the world. Only a completed destiny can reach it. On the day when destiny is reunited, the seal will be removed. That is, when the promised day comes, the current weakened humanity will be in danger. Only by collecting all the fragments will they be able to resist these vile creatures. The Kaiser immediately began asking about the promised day, but the gray-haired man said that he could not tell yet, since that was the agreement. Lost in thought, he asked the old man where he should go to find the fragments of fate, to which he replied that he had heard that one had been seen in Brian. But first, Mr. Cassiar had asked for one favor for his heir. Thinking that Cassiar was a handsome guy, the main character, "What is this?" He was happy with this news, to which the old man, with a smile on his face, asked to exterminate the monsters. After a pause, added that about 1,000 would be enough. Naturally, the main character was surprised, asked again, and thought to himself that he had misheard. However, before the old man answered, the system notified the guy about the extermination of 1,000 creatures. The quest could not be refused. In addition, the system gave a limit of 60 hours, and in case of failure, the class quest would be deleted, and the class would be cancelled. The main character was angry, because it was the same thing every time. But the old man explained that this quest must have a deeper meaning. Gritting his teeth, Kaiser thought that Cassiar was the type from whom you could expect anything. He didn't understand what to do, because in order to make it in 60 hours, he needed to kill one monster every 3 minutes. The old man, in turn, clenched his fist and wished the guy good luck, but the main character immediately interrupted him with a shout, asking where the monsters were found here. But the old man didn't answer. Turning around and starting to run away, Kaiser thought that his affairs were bad. After all, the creatures in Brian are stronger than in Raven, and he needs to kill 1,000 of them before he even has time to get used to it. His thoughts were interrupted by Jihad, who asked the owner why he had hidden that thing. The guy did not understand what they were talking about and asked again, and the goblin explained that he was talking about a curiosity, long, thick, and strong, which Cassiar took out of his pants. The Kaiser immediately shouted that this was 1,000 changes, asking never to describe this thing like that again. Exhaling heavily, the protagonist grabbed it tighter, deciding that he would just test what this thing was capable of. Looking at the characteristics, the black-haired man was surprised that it was of mythical rank. It was the first time he had seen such a thing. In 3 years in Demrock and all the time in Godos, he had never even heard of ranks higher than legendary. He exhaled heavily, swallowed his saliva, and began to think. Opening the system window, he thought it was time to explore what it was capable of. This thing could absorb weapons and take their shape. The system also added that the user's level was too low to utilize the full power, adjusting the weapon's abilities to Kaiser's liking. Lost in thought, the black-haired man said that it was some kind of growing artifact, focusing on the words about absorbing weapons. And so some time passed, and he went to the forest of bad rocks. There were people inside. One of the men was aiming an arrow from his bow. The arrow flew past after being fired at a huge, muscular green creature. However, it attracted the green thug's attention, causing him to turn in the direction of the shot. The man was scared, because the green-skinned one noticed him. A drop of sweat ran down his face. As soon as the monster noticed the man, his expression immediately changed and he began to scream angrily, approaching the man. Suddenly, a powerful attack flew right into the back of his head. A powerful explosion was heard, raising flames. The monster grabbed its head, starting to extinguish its body, which had been damaged during the attack. It was the mage who attacked the monster. The mage shouted at the orc to get out of his sight. At that very second, the swordsman was about to take advantage of the monster's distraction and rush into attack. Having delivered a powerful and accurate blow to the monster's back, Scarlet blood splashed in all directions. However, just a moment later, the swordsman was lying on the ground, as the monster had managed to deliver a powerful attack on the attacker. Standing up, the swordsman shouted that this time they would all attack together. And so, after a rather long battle, they were finally able to defeat the monster. Covered in blood, the green-skinned man fell to the ground, covering the ground in red. The group was quite tired from discussing not-so-simple opponents. The magician said that they managed only thanks to their powers, because everything went much easier, deciding that their journey to Brion was not in vain. The swordsman happily said that this was true, because in this forest right now there was hardly a group with the same training as theirs. These words raised the morale of all the members, so they laughed. Suddenly, they heard footsteps, and immediately looked tensely in the direction where our main character was walking with his companions. Looking at him, they were surprised that he came here without a group, thinking that there was a guard of the monster next to him. They also assessed his equipment, finding it so-so, and after a short pause, they called Kaiser. Approaching him with satisfied faces, they asked if he was really alone here. The protagonist turned to them, examining each member of the group. He answered with a satisfied smile that, yes, because he doesn't have a girlfriend yet to go out with him. After this answer, there was silence, and gradually smiles began to appear on the men's faces. And just a second later, the entire group of men laughed loudly at this answer, considering the guy a joker. They were discussing that there was a noob in front of them who had gotten separated from his group and wandered here, and they were also amused by the club in his hands. Suddenly, the main character felt a mob approaching. Turning around, he noticed another orc. The next one appeared behind him, and both began to approach the black-haired boy. Kaiser looked carefully at the approaching group of monsters. He wasn't particularly happy to see them, as he wanted to chat a little before completing the quest, and then they appeared. But the monsters weren't going to let that happen, so they immediately rushed towards the black-haired man, intending to kill him. Immediately, 1,000 changes began to glow. It began to take the form of the bastard's training sword, gradually taking the form of a sword, glowing brightly. In an instant, the main character jumped up and got closer to them. He didn't have time to play with them, so he quickly cut down each orc. Blood began to splatter in all directions, covering the ground in scarlet. At that very second, the faces of the entire group changed. They couldn't believe their eyes, because this simply couldn't happen. The leader of the group asked his people what had just happened, hoping to hear what he had imagined. However, looking towards our main character, every man wondered who he was. And now, the guy standing in front of them, the one they had just been laughing at, was standing in a fighting stance. The brown-haired man standing behind him wondered if he had imagined it. He said out loud that it was definitely a staff, but he turned into a sword, not believing that such a weapon existed in Godos. At this time, the next angry orc was already approaching the black-haired guy. Turning in his direction, the protagonist looked at him with a terrifying gaze. Immediately, the 1,000 changes began to glow even brighter, changing its shape. In an instant, it transformed from a huge sword into an assassin's dagger. The magician, noticing this, shouted that it had become another weapon again, not believing what was happening, and the main character threw a dagger towards the orc, thereby killing him. The leader of the group did not understand what was happening, because he kept taking out some kind of unseen weapon. They looked at the bloody body of a huge orc with a dagger sticking out of his chest. Having said that he didn't even think that he could take him out with one blow, the protagonist called back 1,000 changes. The dagger felt the call of its owner, so it immediately burst out of the monster's chest, flying straight into the hand of the black-haired protagonist, who was pleased with himself. At this time, a group standing nearby was discussing this power, the weapon, and the guy in general. After turning back to his normal state, the protagonist waved it, and then looked towards the men, shutting them up with one glance. Scratching his head, Kaiser apologized because he got carried away and killed the monsters, thinking that they were going to kill the orcs, and he took their prey. However, they laughed and said that they had already caught a lot today. The boy looked away and said, "That's how it is." At that moment, several more monsters emerged from the thicket of the forest, heading straight towards the main character. Looking at the approaching prey, Kaiser began to wave the 1,000 changes, spinning it in his hand. And then, suddenly getting into a fighting stance, he said that 100 of them needed to be quickly taken down. And so, some time passed. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and around the guy lay a huge number of dead orcs. Exhaling heavily, he said that it was not enough, asking if they would throw him more orcs. However, after looking around, he noticed that there were no people around. The guard explained that he had killed all the orcs, so they went to another place. The protagonist in turn yelled at Black, saying that he couldn't kill everyone alone because there were whole groups of tough guys with crazy physiques. Suddenly, I noticed 2 green-skinned people walking away. Black pointed his finger at them, suggesting that they had noticed him and were running even deeper into the forest. Kaiser laughed because the monsters sensed a predator in him. I thought to myself that it felt like I had leveled up so much after the graduation quest in Raven. Moreover, the weapon received as a reward turned out to be much more powerful than the boy expected. While stretching his body, he suggested taking a little rest and slowing down the pace. Jihad supported him, because it was worth it for the others to enjoy the hunt too. Suddenly, Kaiser's face changed. He didn't understand why he had to share his spoils. At that very second, 1,000 changes began to transform into Raven's black spear. As he charged, he shouted that he would try to graduate with an S rank. Immediately after these words, he began to cut down the orcs left and right, not giving them a chance to escape. He had no intention of leaving anyone behind after killing every creature he encountered here. And then, at some point, the counter reached 127, and just a moment later, the number of killed monsters reached 162, and then 208. A few minutes later, the number of monsters killed reached 249. The orcs had already started to run away as fast as they could after the main character, but he had no intention of stopping, continuing to chop them down. Now the orcs were not making angry roars, but rather roars of requests to be left alone. Suddenly, the main character's body stopped. He felt a wild heaviness. This meant the end of the session. 3 minutes remained. The black-haired man said with heaviness that that was apparently all for today. Hearing these words, it seemed as if the orc breathed a sigh of relief. Suddenly, the main character rushed towards him again, shouting that he needed to quickly kill another one to make it exactly 250. But he was stopped by the activation of the Eye of Truth. The guy's eyes began to glow with a bright yellow light. He stopped and wondered what was going on. Black fell next to him, who, having stood up, began to shout at the owner that he was completely restless, asking him to stand for at least a minute. But the protagonist interrupted him, pointing into the distance, asking if he saw a red light on the rock. The protagonist's guard began to peer carefully into the distance, where the owner was pointing. However, no matter how hard he tried, he said that he saw absolutely nothing there. Having said that if it glows, it means there is something important there, the boy began to climb the rock. And so, having reached the top, Black noticed, asking what it was all about. Touching it, the protagonist thought that for the first time in a long time, the Eye of Truth had worked. He was sure that there was something there. At some point, you even begin to hope that there might be a shard of truth there. But as soon as he touched it, he felt a wild pain, and immediately threw his hand back with a dissatisfied cry. The system announced that he had found a hidden clue that was entered into the adventure book and would find a quest item. Taking the object in his hand, the protagonist saw the name, Ominous Energy, saying out loud that such energy emanated from his guardian from a distance, which Black was not happy about. At that very second, a notification window appeared, saying that there were 10 seconds left until the end of the session, which the guy was not happy about. The guard started shouting, asking what the problem was if the owner left. It was him and Eliza, but the goblin didn't have time to finish his thought because he also began to be transported. The system notified that Eliza and Jihad Black had been transported to the guard room. The little goblin found himself in the center of the forest, immediately looking around. The guard room, the waiting place for the guards. According to the rules, each guard is allocated one room, where they can remain calmly and in complete safety until the owner returns. Black thought that this was only the second time he had entered the guard's room, so it was still unusual for him too. Suddenly, he said that they met for the first time in 150 years. And before he even had time to ask how she was, he began to worry about her even more. Tears appeared on his face. He did not understand when the owner would return, because he wanted to cuddle the spider again. He was screaming that he wanted to sleep next to her, to hug soft Eliza, when suddenly he noticed a house standing in front of him. As he got closer, he couldn't tell if this had ever been there before, deciding that the building looked exactly like the one where he had once lived. Opening the door, he still wondered how this house had ended up here, because even nostalgia had overcome him. He decided to look inside, remembering his past. But as soon as I opened the door, I was very surprised because there was a small spider sitting on the table. At this point, the tears disappeared from the goblin's face and a joyful smile appeared. Exactly the same smile appeared on the face of the spider Eliza. And so, our main character climbed out of the capsule, starting to stretch and warm up his body in real life. He hoped until the very end that he would be able to reach 250 carcasses. But he did not make it. Suddenly, I felt a pleasant smell and immediately paid attention to it. As he left the room, he noticed his little sister sitting at the table, eating. He immediately came up to her and made a sweet face, calling her Sister Good, but she immediately told him to go away. she was not going to share with him. There was a smile on the black-haired older brother's face. Having shouted that 1,000 changes had turned into steel sticks, he rushed towards the plate. However, the little sister managed to block this attack, preventing it from hitting her food. Exhaling heavily, the protagonist shouted that this orc was too strong, while his sister called the guy a slug. She asked her brother to come back to reality, believing that he was a complete zero in games, not understanding why he was showing off. However, the brother got angry, asking if she had ever seen him play, and also if she had ever heard about the main quest. Without answering these questions, the black-haired girl asked her brother if he had already joined any guild, to which he immediately said no, adding that he wasn't even thinking about it yet. Laughing, the girl asked if the scouts had ever even approached him. Gritting his teeth, his brother shouted, asking what difference it made since he would eventually become #1 anyway. She threw up her hands, not understanding how he was going to achieve this, since he wasn't in the top 10 guilds and wasn't even close to being as handsome as Burrs. She also added that he doesn't have 100 million views on YouTube, but his older brother shouted at the top of his lungs that he would succeed. And then he started to leave, and his sister asked why he had become so confident in himself. But the main character didn't answer her, continuing to walk away. Suddenly, turning sharply, he still managed to grab some food, which angered his little sister. And so, sometime later, the boy was already sitting at the computer. He couldn't believe that she dared to provoke him. He was going to show her what he was capable of. I thought I needed to quickly look at what he had recorded and posted in accordance with YouTube trends. So, going on YouTube, he decided to check what they were currently posting by typing the word Godos. And as soon as he made that throw, his face immediately changed. He saw himself, marked Kaiser Returned, which was the title of the video that had garnered 1 million views. While Kaiser was mindlessly enjoying himself, the entire world of Godos began to experience a serious fever. Inside, a huge crowd of people were discussing Kaiser's return, deciding that if he had completed the S-rank quest, then it was definitely him. Among themselves, they also discussed the fact that he had already gone to the Stone Forest. Rumors spread quickly, and a real search began in the forest. Among themselves, they discussed how Kaiser, even during Demrock, hadn't gotten along well with the guilds, suggesting that he had disappeared because of the scouts. Some were thinking about how to make money from Kaiser's return. The scouts sprang into action. The guild leaders couldn't believe that the boy had turned down all the offers. When discussing Godos without a guild, you quickly hit a ceiling, not understanding what the guy is thinking. The leader of the Hero Guild said that Kaiser decided to challenge all the guilds at once. The main character was shocked by the flow of such a huge amount of information about him. The more he read, the more he did not understand when he managed to say that he despised guilds. Although, if you think about it, there was some truth to it. Deciding that while attention was focused on him, he needed to put something out, even with poor editing. After posting the video, he went to bed and said that he was currently on the hype train. He was interested in how many views it takes to make money. And then he even thought about a Ferrari, but immediately dismissed these thoughts because he didn't have a license. And so, with thoughts of wealth, he fell asleep, and morning came. Standing up, he immediately grabbed the phone with trembling hands and started going on YouTube. But as soon as I logged in, I couldn't believe it, because the channel had almost 800,000 subscribers, and the video had garnered almost 4 million views. He couldn't believe it was his channel, because the comments, views, and subscribers kept coming. At that very moment, a satisfied grin appeared on his face, and then he started laughing out loud, shouting at his sister to see how popular he was. However, as soon as he jumped out of the room, he immediately received a ladle to the forehead. The mother asked her son with displeasure what all the noise was about so early in the morning, ordering him to quickly go to the table. Holding his head, he asked where Hyun-ah was, to which she replied that it was Friday, so she was at school. Still scratching his head, he went off to the side, his mother shouting, asking if he would eat. But the guy replied that he would eat later, having bought his mother some beef. Before he could even get out of bed, the protagonist sat back down in the capsule and entered the game. He couldn't stop being happy and decided that he needed to post another video, because that way, he could reach the world level. The system notified that the loyalty level of the Jihad Guardian had increased, causing Guardian Eliza to awaken. At that very second, Jihad Black emerged from the portal, happy to see his master. The protagonist again noticed the goblin's insolent behavior, but he said that they were his own. Kaiser noticed that he had changed, and the goblin was glad to hear such words from his master. He also noticed that Eliza had changed color, and that some kind of necklace had appeared on her neck. Black explained that when they were in the guard room, Eliza's body suddenly glowed and changed color, and she was wearing her favorite necklace, which they found in the guard room. The main character did not understand why they ended up in the same room, nor how they were able to find some necklace there. Scratching Eliza, Jihad said that this was apparently a gift for the spider's good behavior. The protagonist did not understand how this worthless goblin standing in front of him could influence Eliza. Suddenly, he heard human screams that they had found Kaiser. Immediately, a huge crowd came running to the cry. They discussed the guy standing in front of him, as well as his worthless guard. Our boy wasn't going to answer them. He turned around and was about to leave. After all, recruitment into various guilds immediately began. Everyone wanted to get him, promising the best conditions. Seeing the protagonist's disinterest, they immediately surrounded him, not intending to let him escape. The guard didn't understand what was happening, and the main character himself wasn't happy with such popularity. With a smile on his face, he said that it seemed he couldn't escape his popularity. He asked if they had never seen celebrities before, saying that he would take a photo with each one in turn. However, the crowd was not so inclined. They were shouting that the guy was not yet of a very high level. They were going to grab him. The black-haired boy exhaled heavily and thought that it hadn't worked. Immediately, 1,000 changes began to shine, transforming into a silver shield. Taking a fighting stance, Kaiser shouted that the photographs would apparently not work, and then he threw it behind his back, gritting his teeth, realizing that time was against him. Shouting that he had the right to use his form, he waved his shield at the approaching crowd.